Chapter 508. The affairs of the world were like a big dream. How many times did life experience the coolness of autumn? Unknowingly, the immortal city had once again arrived at the chilly autumn with falling leaves. Although during this period of time, Zheng Xianming and Fuyunji's men were busy pursuing and intercepting the evil sex forces in the immortal city, to completely eliminate this malignant tumor from the immortal city, but for the vast majority of the immortal city residents, these things did not affect their lives, and there were even many people who knew nothing about it. People lived in their own world. As long as it was peaceful within their sight, they would think that everyone in the whole world was safe and sound. Therefore, most of us could live happily and with a clear conscience, simply and quietly. Until something woke up the beautiful dream. That day the weather was a little gloomy. The autumn wind that blew from the four-river plain seemed a little harsh and chilly. Dark clouds gathered in the sky, but there was no sign of rain. In short, it was a gloomy day that looked no different from usual. Countless people in the immortal city were living their lives as usual. Everyone did what they were supposed to do. It was bustling and bustling as usual. Mount Sky Dragon stood tall and majestic. The huge statues of the four great divine beasts were still staring at this ancient and huge city as usual. Until a strange phenomenon appeared in the sky. As if there was no warning at all in the sky above the immortal city, in the gloomy sky, suddenly, a strong red light suddenly appeared, and then from east to west, it stretched across the sky, like a boundary line that divided the sky into two halves. Immediately after, dark red light shot out from that red light, covering the sky, but strangely, these light only spread towards one side of the red line, and the other half of the sky was completely unaffected. It was still that gloomy look. Not long after, the sky became half gloomy and half blood red. This was, of course, an unusually rare strange phenomenon, and it happened right above the immortal city. Countless people in the huge city only needed to raise their heads, and they could easily see this scene. The blood-red light flickered and was reflected in the countless eyes that looked up. It was like a burning sea of blood. That strange aura made people subconsciously hold their breath, as if something terrible was about to happen. For that moment, inside and outside Immortal City, below and below Celestial Dragon Mountain, everyone fell into silence. Countless people looked at the sky above their heads, which seemed to have been torn in half. They were dumbfounded and didn't know what to do. However, this phenomenon did not last for too long. In less than 15 minutes, the red light in the sky dimmed. Soon, all the light scattered until the red line that split the sky also disappeared. The sky returned to that gloomy and lifeless day, as if nothing had happened. However, inside and outside the Immortal City, countless discussions and whispers rang out in every corner of the Immortal City. On Mount Tianlong, in front of the Kunlun Temple, Perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Qin stood side by side at the entrance of the temple. Almost at the same time when the phenomenon appeared in the sky, Perfected Lord Tianlan, who was talking to Lu Qin in the temple, sensed something and walked out to look at the sky. Together with Lu Qin, he basically saw this rare and strange phenomenon in the sky from the beginning to the end. When the rainbow light in the sky completely dissipated and everything seemed to return to normal, the master and disciple in front of the Kunlun temple did not speak for a while. Lu Qin glanced at Perfected Lord Tianlan. From the side, he suddenly realized that the usually calm Perfected Lord Tianlan actually had some inexplicable emotions on his face. It seemed to be happy and sad at the same time, and it was hard to tell which was rare. Perhaps sensing Lu Qin's gaze, Perfected Lord Tianlan turned around and exchanged glances with Lu Qin. His expression returned to normal, but he smiled and said, "Have you seen this phenomenon before?" Lu Qin shook his head and said, "I've never seen him before." Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "Yes, it is indeed a rare phenomenon. But judging from your expression just now, you seem to have an opinion?" Lu Qin hesitated for a moment and then said honestly, "Yes, I think it's a little strange because the red light in the sky just now is somewhat similar to the blood moon in the underground maze of the devil cult. But it's hard to say. After all, the entire underground cave is covered by the blood moon, but the sky is divided into two halves. It looks very strange." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him again and then nodded. "You have a good eye. It is indeed similar to the blood moon in the underground palace of the devil cult. There should be some relationship that we don't know yet." Lu Qin was stunned for a moment, but at that moment he heard something different in Perfected Lord Tianlan's words. So after a moment of hesitation he still asked tentatively, "You just said the underground palace of the devil cult? And not the maze of the devil cult?" "The underground palace of the devil cult," Perfected Lord Tianlan said lightly. "As for what exactly the devil cult was, why was the huge underground palace built, and what great secret was there? Perfected Lord Tianlan did not explain in detail to Lu Qin. He just asked Lu Qin lightly, "How's the matter at the devil cult? Have you found Elder Gui's hiding place?" Lu Qin said, "All the hidden spies have basically been removed by us. The devil cult's years of hard work here are almost all gone. We haven't found Elder Gui's whereabouts yet, but after a thorough search, there are not many places where he can hide. At most 2 months, we will be able to catch this old tortoise." Perfected Lord Tianlan first smiled and nodded, saying, "Well done. That old tortoise is cunning and indeed troublesome." As he spoke, he pondered for a moment, then kept his smile and said to Lu Qin seriously, "But the situation is different recently. I can probably give you a month's time at most. Bring that person called Qin He with you. The Fiyunji troops will be jointly commanded by you and Shuang. Do your best to catch this fiend." The corner of Lu Qin's mouth twitched, but he cleverly did not ask whether it was him or Shuang who was in charge of this matter. He only agreed. Then he looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said, "Looks like this red light phenomenon is very important to you?" Perfected Lord Tianlan waved his hand and said, "I'll tell you later." With that, he smiled and walked into the hall with his hands behind his back. Lu Qin looked at his back and suddenly shouted, "Do you want to live or die?" Perfected Lord Tianlan did not even stop walking. Along the way, he only waved his hand casually and said, "Either is fine." With that, Lu Qin did not ask any more. From a certain point of view, Perfected Lord Tianlan's words gave him a lot of power. But when he turned back to look at the calm sky again, an inexplicable anxiety slowly appeared on his face. He raised his head and looked at the sky in a daze, but no matter how he looked, he could not see anything unusual, let alone the mysterious blood moon underground that he was thinking about. A great show seemed to be slowly unfolding. This was a sudden feeling in Lu Qin's heart. Chapter 509. At a certain time during the day, the originally quiet Celestial Dragon Mountain, or more precisely, this area of Fiyunji's territory, suddenly erupted into a commotion. Orders were sent out from the Floating Clouds Division's main hall. They were quickly sent out in all directions by the nimble people. Then, in a short period of time, more people began to gather from different places, like a stone smashing into the water and creating ripples. At this moment there were already many people in the main hall. Most of them stood quietly and solemnly at the side. At the center of the symbol of power, Shuang and Lu Qin stood side by side. Some distance away from them, Old Ma and Qin He also stood there waiting for orders. Different from the people around them who faintly revealed a bit of killing intent, Shuang and Lu Qin's faces looked relatively calm, as if they did not feel that what was about to happen was some earth-shattering event. At least they looked much calmer than the others. Shui Ying's gaze swept across the main hall, intentionally or unintentionally looking at Qin He's face. Then, without turning her head, she only lowered her voice and said in a voice that only Lu Qin beside her could hear, "Look, that Qin He seems a little excited." Lu Qin glanced over there, his expression also unchanging. He said, "There's nothing strange about it. When he first came to our side, his biggest capital was to think that he could help us capture Elder Gui. In the end, after so long, the evil cult has caught many spies, but the biggest one has never been seen. It's only right that he is a little anxious." Shuang suddenly smiled and said, "Right now, the person who wants Elder Gui dead the most is probably him. Maybe right now, his mood is even more anxious than our Fiyunji." Lu Qin's gaze swept over there, and as expected, he saw Qin He standing there. Although at first there did not seem to be anything wrong, after careful observation, one could see that he seemed to subconsciously clench his fists. His gaze was sharp, and he occasionally glanced outside the main hall, as if he was very anxious, hoping that the people gathered here would arrive as soon as possible so that they could do that important thing. Lu Qin retracted his gaze, shook his head slightly and said nothing more. However, both Lu Qin and Shui Ying's attention had been placed on Qin He earlier. Hence, they could tell that there was something strange about Qin He's expression. However, the two of them did not notice that the person standing beside Qin He had also turned his head around at this moment. Although his expression was the same, his eyes were a little strange as he looked at the two of them, who represented status and power in the crowd. Because they were too familiar with each other, people would always subconsciously ignore the people around them, always thinking that they would be the same as before and nothing would change. Perhaps it was because of the many experiences they had in the past, and perhaps it was because of the trust that came from the bottom of their hearts that they would not think too much. It is as if we always think that our friend will always be there for us, as if it is only natural that he or she should be there for all eternity. Even the greatest and most meticulous person would often be like this. Lu Qin's gaze shifted away. he saw that more and more people were entering the Great Hall. Other than Fuyunji's troops, the group of experts dispatched from the Kunlun party had also been called over. He quickly saw Su Qingjun in the crowd. Coincidentally, that woman was also looking in his direction. Lu Qin revealed a trace of a smile, nodded at Su Qingjun and smiled. Unexpectedly, not only did Su Qingjun not smile back, she looked at him with a complicated expression. Her expression was cold, and after a moment she turned her head away without any reaction, as if she did not see him. Lu Qin was startled. He thought, is she angry? But I did not provoke her recently, or is it because something happened to Su Qingjun before and she is unhappy? Seeing that almost everyone had arrived, Shuiying glanced at Lu Qin, a trace of inquiry in her eyes. Lu Qin smiled, took half a step back and at the same time made a modest gesture. Shuiying smiled slightly and did not decline again. She took a step forward. This time, she immediately attracted the attention of everyone in the Great Hall. The few whispers that were originally there immediately quieted down. Today we are going to do something big, Shuiying said straightforwardly. Under the continuous pressure of Fuyunji and Zheng Xianming, in the process of almost non-stop sweeping and exterminating the hidden spies of the evil cult, the people who stood in the light and absolute power could not understand the despair of those who were constantly being pressured, hearing from time to time that their companions around them had died, and having a dark and lifeless future. Despair made people feel pain, it made people crazy, and it also made people have no way out. Even if they once had the most unwavering determination, it was possible for them to collapse at the last moment. This kind of thing happened. Among the last remnants of the evil cult, there were finally people who could not endure it in their hearts, and secretly sought refuge with Fuyunji. Then, like all the traitors in the world, they needed a presentable gift, a proof of allegiance. This proof of allegiance was quickly delivered to Shuiying and Lu Qin. It was a piece of news. The traitor of the evil cult clearly pointed out that there was a very important, illustrious, but extremely mysterious high-ranking figure of the evil cult, who had been secretly arranged to hide in a secret place in a certain immortal city some time ago. And the reason why this traitor knew was because that place was the meaning of his existence. His mission was to protect this kind of important figure in the evil cult to temporarily take refuge. But now, this guardian of the refuge suddenly came to his senses, and felt that he had taken the wrong path in the past, and believed in the wrong person and the evil cult. Everything was the fault of the evil cult and that hateful elder ghost. Fuck the divine tree, fuck the myths and legends of unifying the three realms, they were all lies. I want to live. He did not know the identity of this important figure. But what he knew was that only the true important figures of the evil cult were qualified to hide in his place. When Shuiying's words echoed in the great hall of Fuyunji, everyone became excited. The identity of that deeply hidden important figure seemed to be on the verge of being revealed, and to completely destroy the last vitality of the evil cult, there was probably only one last step left. Shuiying quickly began to make arrangements, and divided the hundreds of elite troops in the great hall into several batches, each with a leader. At the same time, the troops were made up of 10 people, and with an abnormally firm attitude, she explained that the 10 people in each team would supervise the operation together, and if anyone dared to leave the team alone or did anything to report to the outside, they would be immediately arrested and given the right to kill them on the spot. The meaning of this order was naturally clear to everyone. It was nothing more than an estimate that there were still some remnants of the evil cult that had infiltrated into Fuyunji, and in this capture, there was a high possibility that the important figure was Elder Ghost. No matter what, there could not be any accidents. The inescapable net, following the order, was opened. When the troops in the great hall filed out and flew down the mountain, Shuiying and Lu Qin also walked in the same direction. At such an important moment, the two of them naturally had to be present. But as they walked, Lu Qin suddenly realized that Shuiying's face did not seem to have much excitement, but instead looked a little disappointed. Of course, this was all hidden very well. If he was not standing next to her, he might not have noticed it. Lu Qin was about to open his mouth to ask, but then he thought of something and quickly suppressed this thought. He turned his head back to look at the tall and majestic Floating Clouds Division's main hall. This illustrious and prestigious palace towered high above Celestial Dragon Mountain. Sunlight shone on it as if at this moment, it had already reached its most glorious and dazzling moment. Chapter 5:10. When going down the mountain, Qinhe and the team looked a little nervous, seemed to be both excited and agitated and also a little anxious. He found Lu Qin, pulled him aside, lowered his voice and asked Lu Qin, "Will Supreme Tianlan come to today's arrest?" Lu Qin frowned, glanced at Qinhe, his expression was a little strange. Qinhe hurriedly shook his head and said, Don't misunderstand, I have no other meaning. Since I have already decided to rely on Immortal Alliance, I naturally know what to do. But... He suddenly stopped, looked left and right, and then approached Lu Qin, said in a low voice, "But today's matter is really important. If that person is really Elder Gue, we must not make a mistake, otherwise, it will be very difficult to find such a good opportunity next time." Lu Qin was silent for a moment, said, "You don't have confidence in Fiyunji's people?" Qin he smiled bitterly and said, "Of course not, Fiyunji has been fighting with the evil cult for so many years, of course I know how powerful they are. But you also know, Elder Ghost is the last remaining master of the evil faction, and for many years he has always been mysterious and unfathomable. Even though I have been his messenger for many years, I have never been able to find out his background. For such a person, his cultivation realm, Dao skills and supernatural powers, are almost unpredictable." He paused again, said softly, "But if that Elder Gue has some secret means, or if he has secretly cultivated, his cultivation is extremely high, even reaching the level of deity stage, then it will be troublesome. Even if we can suppress him with so many people, we will either suffer heavy casualties or risk of him escaping if we are not careful. But if there is Supreme Tianlan in charge, the situation will be completely different." These words were reasonable, and Lu Qin couldn't refute them for a moment. However, he didn't immediately agree or answer Qin He. Instead, after thinking for a moment, he said, "What you said does make some sense. However, my master is an elusive person, and his whereabouts are unfathomable. Although the various arrangements for today's matter were made by the Floating Clouds Agency, it is only natural that he is aware of it. However, I do not know whether he will come later or whether he will observe from the shadows." Qin He was silent, probably understood something, then nodded to Lu Qin and walked forward. Lu Qin looked at his back, frowned slightly, after a while also continued to walk. To carry out such an important arrest, of course it was impossible to swagger through the streets with a large group of people, and then arrogantly stroll to other people's door and knock. Even if you were strong and had an absolute advantage, this kind of behavior was not awe-inspiring, but would be called retarded. Before going down the mountain, this group of elite people dispersed silently, like water droplets converging into the vast ocean. In the blink of an eye, no trace could be found. However, under the calm sea, there were countless undercurrents that were closing in on the same target from all directions. Lu Qin and the other large group separated, walking on the streets of the Immortal City. He looked inconspicuous, like an ordinary person. Just as he walked near the long street where the explosion had happened before, a series of footsteps sounded behind him. He turned his head to take a look and found that it was old Ma rushing over, walked to his side and walked side by side with him. The two of them often walked in and out together, so they were not afraid of revealing their whereabouts. Lu Qin nodded to greet him, and old Ma also smiled. "Are you nervous? After all, that is the last big head?" Old Ma asked. Lu Qin thought for a moment but smiled and said, "It's all right. You don't say. I have never thought about this before, but after you mentioned it I found that I really don't feel excited. Probably because the evil faction is too weak, we don't really care about it anymore." Old Ma was a little emotional, sighed a few times and said, "How many years has it been? In the early years, I always felt that the evil faction was still a huge monster, the mortal enemy of our good faction. To defeat them was extremely difficult, and we don't know how much blood and lives had to be sacrificed, but in the end, today it has become like this." Lu Qin lightly said, "Things are always done by people. If they did not do those things in the past, they would not have become like this so quickly." Old Ma was silent for a moment, then smiled and nodded and said, "You are right." The two of them walked through the long street, passing by the place that was blown to pieces, and there was only a big pit, and it was also tightly surrounded by many layers of cloth. Looking at the guards outside, Lu Qin and old Ma both took a few steps to the side, and stayed away from that place. "Recently, I have been too busy to come here, and I thought that this place should have been filled up. Why is it still like this?" If it was only for a passage to enter and exit the underground maze, it was indeed only necessary to leave a passage. This long street was bustling, and it was indeed very inconvenient to enclose a piece of land like this for a long time. Standing beside Lu Qin, old Ma glanced over there and then whispered, "I know this. I heard that not only did they not reduce the number of guards, but they also seem to have increased the number of people recently, and the defense seems to be impenetrable. Now, except for the Starry Temple's own people, almost no one from other halls can go to the underground maze." Lu Qin paused for a moment and said thoughtfully, "Speaking of which, it seems that after we left that place we did not go down again." Old Ma shrugged and said, "Isn't that so? But from what you said, it seems that there is no reason to go down there. Lu Qin smiled and did not answer. Old Ma and him walked a few steps forward and suddenly coughed and asked Lu Qin, "Oh yes, when I was going down the mountain just now, I saw Qin. He specially ran over to look for you and whispered to you for a long time. At this time, why did he look for you?" Lu Qin did not think too much and said, "Oh, that's because he was a little worried and ran over to ask me about the whereabouts of the damn Baldy, and whether he will go over today." Old Ma's expression suddenly changed and Lu Qin glanced at him and said, "Don't worry, I just brushed it off and did not say anything." Old Ma shook his head and said, "No, why did this guy suddenly ask about Sir's whereabouts? Could it be that he has other plans?" Lu Qin pondered for a moment and shook his head and said, "This should not be the case. Right now, among our group, the one who wants Elder Ghost dead the most is probably Qin He. But he is worried that the old tortoise's cultivation is too high, and he is afraid that we will let him escape." Old Ma nodded and then said with some disdain, "He thinks too much." Lu Qin also smiled and turned his head. Seeing that they were unknowingly about to cross the long street, he suddenly thought of something, and suddenly raised his head to look at the sky above his head, and then turned back to look at the place that was tightly surrounded by cloth. Suddenly Lu Qin was startled and saw that above the ground that was surrounded by the cloth, there was suddenly an inconspicuous auspicious cloud floating over, and then quietly landed, disappearing into the depths of the heavy cloth, and in a blink of an eye, disappeared without a trace. Who was that? Chapter 511. Unlike the scene of many Starry Hall's disciples bustling about in the underground maze a while ago, this huge underground city was still shrouded in a strange blood-red light, but almost no one could be seen as far as the eye could see. The people of Starry Hall who were working here had already evacuated, perhaps because of the omnipresent and elusive strange aura, or because they had already done what they should do. In the huge underground city, many tall buildings stood silently. They were empty, but they seemed to be quietly waiting for their owners to return at some point in time. A tall and burly figure appeared in this huge underground cave and walked into the long street of the underground city. When the light from the blood moon in the sky shone on his head, it would occasionally refract a strange halo. Starry Hall had already sealed this place and did not allow outsiders to enter or leave. Even most of the other halls in Zhangxianming were the same. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan was an exception. Looking from afar, his wide sleeves fluttered as he walked, making him look like he was walking in a sea of blood. Every step he took seemed to leave a blood-red footprint on the ground. The empty city looked especially cold and murderous. However, as he gradually walked into this city that was bathed in the blood-red light, some strange and distorted runes gradually appeared in his line of sight. These runes were carved on the road, the corner of the wall, the door frame, the stone, and all sorts of corners. They seemed to be unrelated, but in fact they were indistinctly independent. At a certain moment, after true Lord Tianlan's footsteps crossed an invisible boundary, suddenly, like a stone thrown into calm water, a series of ripples abruptly appeared around his body. The light and shadow in the air suddenly twisted and trembled, as if a wall of water was erected in front of him and swayed. It twisted into a strange mirror image in front of Perfected Lord Tianlan, reflecting his shadow. It was as if another version of him had suddenly appeared in front of him, staring at him coldly. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression did not change as he looked at his other self indifferently before walking over. His body passed through the figure and continued forward without a sound. The figure actually turned around and looked at his back. Then it began to tremble and gradually dissipated into the air. The surroundings were silent, as if it had suddenly quietened down. Actually, after the Starry Hall disciples left, there was basically no sound in this underground cave. It was very quiet. However, when one was inside, there would more or less be some sounds, for example, the sound of unknown insects in certain corners, or the sound of wind drifting from the corner of a certain cave entrance. However, after crossing that invisible line, all the sounds in the city suddenly disappeared. It was a true silence that seemed to isolate all sounds outside of that invisible boundary. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked around and nodded slowly. There was a hint of satisfaction on his face. Then he continued to walk forward until he reached the center of the underground city, next to the huge statue that connected the ground and the dome of the subterranean cavern. Perfected Lord Guyu of the Starry Hall was sitting here a few times before. The two of them would chat when they met. However, it was rare that even Perfected Lord Guyu was not around this time. It could be considered as truly empty. Perfected Lord Tianlan pondered for a moment. His gaze fell on the spot where Perfected Lord Guyu usually meditated. After a while he walked over and stood there. Everything seemed to be the same. The only difference was that he was a little closer to the statue. After a while, when perfected Lord Tianlan looked up at the sky, he soon realized that when he looked at the blood moon from this position, he seemed to be able to see a gap in the red light around the blood moon. In that gap, the blood moon seemed to be rotating slowly. In the past, there were no gaps around the blood moon at all. This place was clearly something that had appeared not long ago. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and did not seem to be too bothered. Then he walked to the side of the statue and reached out his thick and broad palm to press on it. It was ice cold. The statue did not move. But after a while, something seemed to throb behind the stone. Then a terrifying aura suddenly rushed out from the depths of the statue. The aura was ferocious, and the number seemed to be unbelievably large. It was as if there were tens of thousands of evil spirits imprisoned in this huge statue. Then, at this moment, they suddenly felt the aura of the flesh and blood of a living person, and immediately surged out like raging waves. The statue remained motionless, as if all the movements had nothing to do with it. However, in the depths of the stone, a terrifying roar seemed to come from the depths of the netherworld. Wave after wave after wave, endlessly, crazily rushed towards perfected Lord Tianlan. Thud, 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 a strange and deep sound slowly rang out. It was originally extremely soft and almost inaudible to ordinary people. However, in the middle of this extremely quiet underground city, it was exceptionally clear and made one's hair stand on end. However, there was no fear on perfected Lord Tianlan's face. He even looked at the stone surface of the huge statue in front of him with a look of disdain. He slowly raised his hand and gradually left the stone surface. As if sensing that the warm aura of flesh and blood was gradually leaving, the strange voices behind the stone suddenly became agitated. All sorts of strange, mournful and terrifying roars rose and fell, shouting at the top of their lungs. However, they were imprisoned by the stone and all their desires were destined to turn into nothingness. The hand left the stone surface. Wong. Like a string suddenly hitting a high note, all the noise suddenly disappeared as if it had never existed in the first place. The statue was still a statue and the stone surface was still a stone. There was no change and no strange things appeared again. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked down indifferently. His gaze landed on the place where the statue was deeply buried in the ground. A pondering expression appeared on his face as he raised his head to look at the blood moon above his head. In the end, he suddenly let out a soft sigh and muttered to himself, "It should be soon. There's only one last step left." Before he finished speaking, perfected Lord Tianlan's body suddenly paused and he raised his eyebrows. He instantly turned around and his eyes were cold and bright. An indescribable aura suddenly surged in all directions like a huge flood. At that moment, even the omnipresent blood-red light seemed to avoid this burly figure. Then the surroundings became silent. There was no sound at all and no trace of anyone. However, perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes, which were as deep as the night, were rippling as he coldly swept his gaze across the surroundings. After a while, his gaze slowly stopped at a house near the city. As the light floated, it passed through the doors and windows, the courtyard, the empty corridors, the stone paths, the wasteland, and then a deep well that had long dried up. A dark shadow was hiding in the depths of the well. There was no warmth or aura from its body. It was like a natural stone that silently stayed in the darkness. Everything happened just now. When the terrifying and strange aura from the statue appeared and disappeared in an instant, his heart beat slightly faster. In the distance, perfected Lord Tianlan stared at the house and frowned. Chapter 512. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not deliberately lighten his footsteps, nor did he look nervous or cautious as if he was facing a great enemy. He merely walked towards the house as if he had sensed something. He walked calmly, naturally, calmly and confidently, as if he was completely fearless, as if there was nothing in this world that was worthy of his scruples, even if he was in this desolate underground labyrinth, even if the scene of thousands of ghosts roaring had just happened not long ago. He looked as if he did not believe in heaven and earth, did not respect ghosts and gods and despised fate. He only cared about himself and believed in his own strength. That was why he didn't even bother to lighten his footsteps or disguise himself. He just walked straight into the empty mansion with a wave of his wide robe sleeves. The house that was shrouded by the red light of the blood moon had a strange color. At first glance, it even looked as if the walls and house were slowly oozing blood. If a timid person were to come here, he would probably be scared to death. However, to perfected Lord Tianlan, these were, of course, meaningless illusions. There was not even the slightest ripple in his eyes as he calmly swept his gaze across the surroundings and observed the house. Under the red light, it was as silent as the outside. There was no sound at all. The extremely faint movement that had suddenly appeared at a certain moment earlier had naturally disappeared without a trace. In retrospect, that extremely faint movement that could not even be considered a sound was more likely just a momentary trance or a momentary illusion. Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned as he stood at the entrance of the house, quietly looking at every corner of the house as if he was lost in thought. At the same time, in the deserted backyard of the house, at the bottom of the dry well, where darkness shrouded, that black figure seemed to have completely turned into a lifeless stone, sitting motionlessly against the wall. There was no warmth, no breath, and no heartbeat. He did not even look like a dead person, but rather a stone that was as good as new. Perfected Lord Tianlan stood at the entrance for a long time, but still did not take any further action. It seemed that he was not sure what had happened just now, or perhaps he had only suddenly sensed a slight movement in the direction of the house, but after he came over, all the movements had disappeared. So, was it an illusion or did it really exist? Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes shone brightly as he continued to scan the mansion. The invisible yet fearsome aura emanating from his body seemed to seep into every corner of the mansion. A moment later he suddenly strode forward and walked into the house. In the dark well, the black shadow that had almost completely fallen into a deathly stillness raised its head slightly in the darkness. There seemed to be a strange light flickering in the darkness. He looked a little nervous. Peng peng, the footsteps were neither fast nor hurried as they steadily and forcefully stepped on the ground. Although there wasn't any great commotion, the figure in the darkness could clearly feel that some of the creatures living in the darkness in the depths of the soil beneath him, the little bugs and monsters that were far away from the surface and had never seen light their entire lives, were all fleeing in all directions, desperately trying to leave this place. A gust of wind suddenly blew past this place. There was almost no wind here. The figure in the darkness seemed to sense something and slowly raised his head. He looked up and vaguely saw a tall and burly figure suddenly appear near the mouth of the well. The light of the blood moon shone down from above, casting a black shadow on Perfected Lord Tianlan's broad body and shrouding the mouth of the well. Perfected Lord Tianlan stopped in his tracks. This was the first time he had stopped walking from the front hall to the backyard. It was a desolate scene around him. Apart from himself, there seemed to be no other signs of life. There was nothing out of the ordinary. Everything seemed to be silent, empty, and lifeless. After a moment, Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze swept across all the corners of the place. Then he frowned slightly and his gaze landed on the last corner, that dry well. The large group of people from Fuyunji split up and snuck into the ocean-like Immortal City. Then 2 hours later, they quietly gathered from all directions and appeared outside a large mansion in the Vermilion Bird district of the Immortal City. Without a sound, they dispersed all the irrelevant people in the surroundings and suppressed all the abnormal noises. It was said that in the past there was a lame joke in the Immortal City. It was said that the name of Zhengxianmeng Fuyunji could stop children from crying at night. This was used to make fun of the devil sect demons in the Immortal City for hiding like children. However, based on today's performance, even if the name of Fuyunji didn't make everyone fearful, it at least made most people revere them. Almost everyone cooperated and left. Thus, in silence, the people from Fuyunji surrounded this place. On the long street outside the mansion, Lu Qin and Old Ma stood side by side. Old Ma looked at the mansion that occupied a large area and sighed. These devil sect bastards seemed to be quite rich. Then he said to Lu Qin in a low voice, "I say, do you think the big guy hiding in this house today could it be that old turtle?" Lu Qin pondered for a moment, nodded and said, "I think there is at least a 70% chance that it is him. Some time ago, we wiped out many of the devil sect spies and informants. Almost all of their nests were wiped out by us. No matter how cunning and treacherous Elder Ghost is, the places he can hide in will definitely become less and less. Other than that, in the devil sect today, especially in the Immortal City, other than Elder Ghost, I really can't think of anyone else who can be considered as a big shot in the sect." Old Ma made a sound of acknowledgement and seemed to agree with Lu Chen's words. His face also revealed a look of anticipation. He clenched his fist and waved it and said, "After getting rid of that old turtle, I want to see how those devil sect bastards can still stir up trouble. They will probably perish here." Lu Chen smiled and said, "I hope so." As he spoke, he glanced at the house. In the depths of his eyes, a trace of complicated emotion flashed past. Even though it was a blood feud, even though they were irreconcilable enemies, even though the devil sect was so weak and Lu Chen had contributed a lot, not to mention that everyone wanted to kill each other as soon as possible, but Lu Chen had after all lived in the devil sect for many years. Seeing this sect that had been passed down for 1,000 years was about to reach its end, he also felt an inexplicable emotion in his heart. The once flourishing, the heroes and heroism, all like the morning dew in a dream, disappeared in the past history, never to return. In front of them there was a tall and charming figure. That was Shuang. After arranging everything, Shuang also seemed to feel that she had vaguely ushered in the highest peak of her life. That sense of accomplishment and satisfaction made her face exude an astonishing beauty. She raised her hand and waved heavily towards the house. Instantly, countless figures charged in from all directions while furious roars and shocked cries resounded. After a short moment, miserable and shrill cries pierced through the tranquility of the city, and they reverberated throughout the bright world, causing the clear sky to be covered in a layer of blood-red shadows. Chapter 5:13. After becoming the leader of a force and grasping power, there would be all kinds of benefits. One of the most important benefits was that in most cases, the leader would no longer have to rush to the front lines and risk his life to fight. The same reason also applied to the few trusted subordinates of the leader. What was so good about fighting and risking their lives? There was always the danger of swords and axes, and their lives were in danger. Moreover, it was very unsightly to shout and roar in a fierce battle. There was no grace and majesty. How could it compare to standing at the back and giving orders in a safe place? It was the most worthwhile thing in the world to let others do the dangerous things, and to take the credit and the fruits of the battle was the best thing in the world. Of course, most things in this world were fair. Most people who could reach this level of status had experienced countless difficult trials and suffered untold hardships to reach this step. Although there were a few people who were lucky enough to reach the sky in a single step, there were still a few people who were lucky enough to reach the sky in a single step. Old Ma had benefited from Lu Qin. At this moment he did not rush to the front lines to experience the bloody slaughter, which made him feel very lucky. However, he more or less felt a little uncomfortable. Later on, when he heard the sounds of fighting and miserable cries coming from the big house on the other side of the wall, he faintly felt a little ashamed. Then he realized that it was probably because he didn't fight with his companions from the Floating Clouds division and stood in a safe place, as if he was a deserter. He could not help but look at Shuang and Lu Qin, who had already walked to the front and were standing side by side to observe the situation. Then he found that their faces were calm and indifferent, as if everything that was happening in front of them was a matter of course. There was not even a hint of anxiety or nervousness on their faces, let alone a hint of guilt. Could it be that he was not thick-skinned enough? As this thought flashed across Old Ma's mind, he suddenly heard a burst of exclamations and screams in the big house. A moment later, a man's voice suddenly roared loudly, "Who are you? How dare you kill innocent people in broad daylight?" No one replied. Or rather, the most direct answer was the sound of blades clanging and shadows. That man's voice was quickly interrupted. After a series of booming sounds, it was obvious that the voice was much weaker. At the same time, it carried a bit of mournfulness, anger and despair. He shouted sternly, "Let me tell you, this is the property of Heavenly Law Hall. Aren't you afraid of angering Supreme Taihu by doing this?" When these words reached them, Shuang, Lu Qin and even Old Ma, who was standing to the side, were all startled, their expressions changing slightly. Lu Qin immediately turned his head to look at Shuang. Shuang sensed his gaze and frowned slightly, but after a moment of silence she shook her head and said, "I've investigated this family's background before and there's no such thing." Lu Qin was silent for a moment, then nodded without saying anything. But Old Ma, who was standing beside him, hesitated for a moment, then took a step forward and said in a low voice, "It could also be a private property that Supreme Taihu had secretly arranged, or an estate that belonged to someone else under his name. Otherwise he wouldn't have mentioned only Supreme Taihu by name, and not the other Supreme Lords." He paused for a moment, then said softly, "If we're not careful, I'm afraid that it might cause the two lords to be unhappy and fight." Lu Qin frowned. After a moment he said in a deep voice, "Once the bow is shot, there's no turning back. It's useless to say these things now." Old Ma nodded, said no more and stood back. That was indeed the case. Currently the big house was filled with the sounds of killing. Those who should be killed, many were killed, and those who should be killed, many died. How could they turn back? As for what would happen later, if Supreme Taihu were to be angry and punish them, they could only rely on Supreme Tianlan to bear the brunt. Fortunately, after so many years, perfected Lord Tianlan did not disappoint in these matters. When Lu Qin, Old Ma, and the others encountered difficulties and simply and crudely threw all the possible bad results to Supreme Tianlan, The person whom they had high hopes on, of course, could also be said to be the biggest scapegoat, the damned Baldy whom Lucien often talked about, was standing in the underground city. In the blood-red light, he looked calm but somewhat solemn, staring at the dried-up well not far away in front of him. He had inspected almost every place in the mansion, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. Only this dry well in the wasteland of the backyard could be considered the last blind spot. If there were no suspicious points here, even Supreme Tianlan had to admit that he had probably sensed wrongly at that moment. There was no dangerous person here as he suspected. At least for now, the mouth of the well was dry, cracked, and covered with dust. It seemed that it had not been used for many years, not to mention that there might be something hidden under it. However, perfected Lord Tianlan didn't intend to give up halfway. Although he wasn't sure if the outsider he suspected was hiding here, it wouldn't hurt to take a look at this place since it was the only place left. Soon he came to the edge of the mouth of the well. His tall figure covered the mouth of the well. Just when he was about to lean over to take a look, his body suddenly paused. Supreme Tianlan suddenly raised his head and looked back. An auspicious cloud flickered in the sky for a moment before dispersing. A moment later, the sound of footsteps could be heard. After a while, a silhouette appeared at the entrance of the house. The person hadn't arrived, but the sound had arrived first. "I say, what are you doing here alone?" Along with the laughter, Supreme Guyu of the Starry Hall appeared in his sight. He walked over with a smile and at the same time he clicked his tongue in admiration. He looked around the house a few times and then said to Supreme Tianlan with a smile, "Could it be that you found some treasures buried by the demon clan? Let me tell you, if there's really such a good thing, you can't hide it from me. Everyone who sees it has a share." Perfected Lord Tianlan rolled his eyes, straightened his body at the entrance of the well, and turned around to face Perfected Guyu. "What treasure? Is there really such a thing? Your subordinates have almost turned this place upside down these days. What can't they find?" Perfected Lord Tianlan rolled his eyes. Supreme Guyu did not refute and said with a smile, "Maybe their cultivation is too low and they can't find the hidden treasure." Perfected Lord Tianlan scoffed and took 2 steps towards him with his hands clasped behind his back. "I was here a while ago. I felt that there was something strange in this house, as if someone was hiding here. That's why I came to take a look." Supreme Guyu was shocked and said, "There's actually such a thing? Did you find the person?" Supreme Tianlan shook his head and said, "No." After a pause he frowned and said, "That voice was too weak and soft. Did I hear wrongly?" Guyu Perfected Monarch thought for a while, then pointed at the blood moon above her head and said, "Now that this place is constantly illuminated by the blood moon's radiance day and night, it greatly affects us cultivators. Perhaps you are also affected by the blood moon, that's why you made a mistake?" Supreme Tianlan hesitated for a while and then nodded slowly. He said, "What you said seems to make some sense." Supreme Guyu smiled and made an inviting gesture. The two of them walked out side by side. At the same time, Supreme Guyu said, "When I came here today, I saw your subordinates from Fuyunji gathering and going down the mountain. It seems like they're going to do something big?" Supreme Tianlan looked at him and nodded. He said, "Yes, they told me that they're going to capture that Elder Gue and bring him to me today." Chapter 514. Guyu True Lord laughed. His expression did not show much surprise. People who were in their positions, of course they were not people who were isolated from the news. There would always be all kinds of news transmitted to them through different channels. As to the degree of truth and falsehood and how to make use of it, it was up to these bigwigs themselves to choose. So, Guyu True Monarch seemed to not particularly care about that extremely famous evil sect's last important leader, Elder Ghost. Speaking of this matter, although the evil sect was still notorious, intimidating, synonymous with the evil sects, the public enemy of the world's good faction, and also the #1 enemy that Zhang Xianming had erected, but in fact, in the eyes of those bigwigs in Zhang Xianming, the evil sect was no longer in their eyes. Even if the evil sect still tossed around a few times and made some movements, but obviously everyone looked down on the evil sect more and more, no longer changing their expressions at the mention of the tiger in the past. However, when Guyu True Lord and True Lord Tianlan talked about this matter, of course, they did not intend to discuss the current situation of the evil sect. At most, he only smiled and said to True Lord Tianlan, "Evil sect Elder Ghost is after all the last elder level figure, the depth of his cultivation is still unknown, why don't you go and hold the fort for a while?" True Lord Tianlan said indifferently, "That old tortoise has been lurking in the immortal city for tens of years and did not dare to show his head, cowering all day long, what future can he have? I don't believe that a true lord who has cultivated to deity transformation realm would be so cowardly. Since that's the case, this person is not to be feared. Guyu True Lord nodded, seemed to agree with True Lord Tianlan's words. He sighed and said, indeed so, thinking back to the past, although the evil sect was ferocious at its peak, but in the sect, there were indeed many outstanding geniuses. Who would have thought that today the descendants are really so unbearable? True Lord Tianlan disdainfully smiled and said, now in the evil sect it's just incompetent people, but in the first 10 to 20 years, there were Yun Zhongyang and a few other old men who could look after it. It could be considered as barely maintaining the situation. Who do these people think they are? Guyu Perfected Monarch laughed. Speaking of this, weren't those old men still killed by you in the end? Back then when I heard about this matter, I really sucked in a breath of cold air. The shadow you sent out was really amazing. He was so patient and tenacious, and his final strike was even more ruthless. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that he changed the situation with a single sword strike. When he spoke up to hear, he shook his head and sighed. At that time, I was thinking that if there really is such a person hiding by my side and not giving himself away for 10 years, then I'm afraid I won't be able to escape this sword from the back at the critical moment. Tao techniques, divine arts, and perfected monarchs are nothing in front of such a terrifying assassin. Perfected Lord Tianlan raised his brows slightly and smiled with a calm expression. Brother Guyu, you must be joking. We're people who have cultivated to the soul formation realm after all. How can we be so easily schemed against? Even if it's his trusted aide, it won't be easy for him to succeed. Perfected Lord Guyu laughed and then waved his hand. Speaking of which, where did the two of us go? Let's not talk about it anymore. Alright, I actually came over to talk to you about another matter. It's related to the Elder Gue that your subordinates are chasing today. However, it has nothing to do with the fiend cult. Is that mansion? Perfected Lord Tianlan was slightly surprised. What about that mansion? Is there a problem? Perfected Lord Guyu hesitated for a moment. I've also heard some news. After thinking about it, I'll tell you about it. Today you guys went to surround that mansion. On the surface, it's obviously unrelated people. However, in reality, the owner might be the adopted daughter of Heavenly Law Hall's Perfected Lord Tiehu, Song Wenji. Perfected Lord Tianlan was clearly startled. He didn't expect Perfected Lord Guyu to actually say this. And Perfected Lord Guyu saw Perfected Lord Tianlan's surprised expression. After a moment of silence, he also revealed a trace of a bitter smile. You're quite surprised too, right? Not to mention you, when I first heard about this, I was also a little stunned. For so many years, old Tiehu has always thought of himself as a virtuous person. Normally he is also very strict with others and himself. Logically speaking, even if he dotes on this adopted daughter very much, he shouldn't have given her. Perfected Lord Guyu thought for a moment. Could it be that Song Wenji, this girl, is spoiled and arrogant? Relying on old Tiehu's reputation and power, she took everything for herself and bought this estate? That mansion occupied a rather large area and was located in the prosperous area of the world's #1 immortal city. Its value couldn't be underestimated. An ordinary cultivator wouldn't be able to afford it. Moreover, Song Wenji herself was only a young lady in her early 20s. Then where did this money come from? And why did she have to cover up the owner of the house? Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Perfected Lord Guyu. After staring for a while, he suddenly laughed. You're not being honest. Why don't you dare to say it directly? Must you make me say it? Perfected Lord Guyu smiled. My star hall is small and weak. How can I afford to offend those righteous gentlemen from Heavenly Law Hall? Perfected Lord Tianlan spat. You already know that Heavenly Law Hall is in trouble. Why do you think I dare to offend them? Perfected Lord Guyu said seriously, you're a hooligan, stronger than him. Scram. Perfected Lord Tianlan glared at the cunning Perfected Lord Guyu. After pondering for a moment, he said, as you said, this mansion probably has something to do with old Tiehu. As for whether there are still evil cult demons hiding inside, it's hard to say. Perfected Lord Guyu nodded. So after thinking about it, I still have to come and tell you. The situation over there is a little delicate. You should go and keep an eye on it. Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a while before nodding in agreement. Then he frowned and said, if old Tiehu is really muddle-headed, I can't give in to him in front of so many subordinates. Perfected Lord Guyu shook her head. That old thing is very prideful. As long as you really catch the evil cult demons, I'm afraid he definitely won't come out. That's true. Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly sneered. He seemed to have some disdain for the highly respected head of Heavenly Law Hall. Perfected Lord Jianghu. Then he waved his sleeve and strode towards the door. When he passed by Perfected Lord Guyu suddenly called out to him and said, "Oh right, that shadow from the Battle of the Desolate Valley, is he still under you? Can you find a chance to let me meet him?" Seeing Perfected Lord Tianlan's strange gaze, Perfected Lord Guyu smiled and said, "This kind of talent, I've been fascinated by him for a long time. I really want to meet him and see what kind of outstanding person he is." Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment. Then he shook his head and said, "He was unlucky. During the Battle of the Desolate Valley, his injuries were too heavy and he has already died." Perfected Lord Guyu was startled. Then he nodded and Perfected Lord Tianlan left. Perfected Lord Guyu looked at his back. His expression gradually turned cold. After a while he seemed to have thought of something inside. He muttered to himself, "Perfected Lord Guyu isn't afraid of the shadow's sneak attack? Then how did your senior brother die back then?" Chapter 5:15. Was there any secret collusion between the Jianghu Immortal of the Heavenly Law Hall and the Devil Cult? Most people in the world probably didn't believe it. To be honest, even Perfected Lord Tianlan himself didn't think it was possible. Although there was an old saying that one could not know a man's heart from his face, and Tianlan, who was also a deity transformation stage lord and had great influence in Zhangxianming, actually knew some secrets about Jianghu Immortal that outsiders did not know. But even so, Lord Tianlan did not think that the old Jianghu would be so stupid. Because it was not worth it and there was no need for it. Before the rise of Lord Tianlan, Jianghu Immortal could be regarded as a leading figure in Zhangxianming. His fame, reputation and strength were second to none. In addition, he had painstakingly maintained an upright image for many years, and had always been respected by the righteous cultivators in the world. At that time, it was not an exaggeration to say that he was respected by the whole world. However, talented people emerged in every generation. After true Lord Tianlan, who was much younger than him, entered the union of true immortals, he changed his image of a deity realm true lord who had been calm and steady for many years. He was determined to forge ahead, worked hard, and especially grasped the devil cult, which was a big threat to the evil sects that everyone in the world was very afraid of. He launched an unusually high-profile and fierce war and became the leader of the pro-war faction in the Union of True Immortals, which was a huge organization and quickly expanded his strength. He also established Fuyunji, recruited masters and acted fiercely. He was unscrupulous in promoting talents to the devil cult, and catered to the wishes of a large number of young cultivators. He formed a sharp contrast with the other calm and prudent old immortals in Zhangxianming. Because of this, his power grew rapidly and the more he fought, the stronger he became. In the end, he suppressed the devil cult outside and subdued many halls inside, and became the new leader of the Zhangxianming generation in one fell swoop. Such a talented and bold man attracted the admiration and respect of many young people. However, at the same time he also attracted the disdain and dissatisfaction of the older generation. Among them, the discord between Immortal Tai Hu and Immortal Tianlan was a secret known by everyone in Sky Dragon Mountain. Of course, they were all bigwigs with high status, so they had to keep up appearances. For example, when Immortal Jianghu held a ceremony to accept Lu Chen as his disciple previously, Immortal Jianghu still came. However, even though the two of them were secretly at odds with each other, and the house at the foot of the mountain was rumored to be related to Immortal Jianghu, but when true Lord Tianlan saw the house that was embroiled in a fierce battle from afar, he still did not believe that Immortal Jianghu would really betray the good faction and collude with the evil cult. If the old man had such a thought, he would have discovered it long ago and used it as an excuse to put him to death. Indifferently and calmly, true Lord Tianlan thought about the various means of the other divine transformation stage true lord. Suddenly, as if he had sensed something, he raised his head and glanced at the sky. The weather was fine today. There were clouds in the sky, but the clouds were a little thick. He stared at the thickest part of the clouds and frowned. The faces of Shuaying and Lu Chen did not look too good. In any case, offending a divine transformation stage true lord, even if it was unintentional, was a heavy psychological burden for ordinary cultivators. For many years, the status of divine transformation stage true lords in the vast cultivation world of the divine land had long been like that of a god, high above the masses and revered by tens of thousands of people. If at this time the old divine transformation stage true lord of Heaven's Law Hall suddenly arrived, flew into a rage and even started a massacre, and the big backer behind Fuyunji did not arrive in time, then the situation would become very ugly and very dangerous. And the most troublesome thing was that everyone was in the Zhangxianming system. There were almost no powerful means to restrict this kind of big shot. The most effective way was of course to have another divine transformation stage true lord come forward to confront him. This was also the reason why, for many years, in such a huge organization like Zhangxianming, there were all kinds of mountain factions, but in the end almost all of them belonged to the forces of a few divine transformation stage true lords. Therefore, at this moment what these two people were most concerned about was whether or not there were people from the evil cult in this house. If they caught the evil cult demon, then everything could be easily solved. The evidence was right there, even Tai Hu true lord could not say much, and instead had to spend effort to exonerate himself. It should be known that Fuyunji was not a small hall without a backer. Behind it stood the current number one person in Zhangxianming, Tianlan true lord. Xueying had already passed down the order to tighten up the encirclement. No one must be allowed to escape. Killing people could be slow, the most important thing was to quickly confirm that the people resisting here were evil cult demons. But as the battle continued, the news that came out was not very optimistic. The resistance inside the house was very tenacious, and there were many experts hidden in this inconspicuous house. But what was more troublesome was that almost all of the people inside were of unknown origins. In other words, almost none of them had any marks or items related to the evil cult. And that so-called big shot for the time being had not been caught. Xueying waited for a while, and suddenly called over a person beside her to ask a few questions. That person then quickly left and entered the house. After a while he came back and directly walked to Xueying's side to reply. Xueying had no intention of hiding from Lu Qin, so that person did not lower his voice, so that Lu Qin and old Ma beside him could hear his words. Actually, his reply was not complicated. He only told Xueying that Qin he was still here, and that he was indeed with the main force and was charging at the forefront. His attacks were ruthless and incomparably fierce, and he was even more hard-working than the people of Fuyunji. After that person finished speaking, he retreated. Xueying turned back to look at Lu Qin, who was expressionless. Instead, it was old Ma who smiled and with some intention of smoothing things over said, "That's not bad, at least it seems that Qin he is not a problem. Let's see if we can catch that elder Gui later. I don't think it will be a big problem." Xueying frowned and said, "Let's talk about it after we catch him." As she said this, she turned back, looking a little impatient. Obviously, the sudden appearance of this matter that might involve true monarch Jianghu made her a little anxious. In comparison, Lu Qin was much calmer. At the same time, they heard the sounds of fighting in the house becoming louder and louder. It seemed that the battle had reached its most intense point, and the outcome was about to be decided. At this moment, suddenly behind them, on the street that had been cleared by the people of Fuyunji, and on the street where all the unrelated people had been chased away, a figure suddenly appeared. Like a ghost, the figure appeared on the long street and then walked towards them. The three of them turned their heads to look, and then their expressions changed slightly. The person who came was a young and beautiful woman with a charming appearance. It was true monarch Jianghu's adopted daughter, Song Wenji. There were already people chasing after them, and their expressions were stern as if they were about to attack. However, Song Wenji did not even look at the people behind her, and only walked towards Lu Chen's group. Moreover, her gaze only seemed to casually sweep over Xueying and old Ma, and finally stopped on Lu Chen's face. Seeing that the Fuyunji guards chasing behind them were about to catch Song Wenji, Xueying suddenly frowned and then waved her hand. The guards were startled for a moment, and then immediately obeyed and retreated. For a moment, many people on the long street looked over. They saw Song Wenji calmly walk in front of the three people. To be exact, among the three of them she seemed to only pay attention to Lu Qin. She stood in front of Lu Qin and then looked straight into Lu Chen's eyes. Her gaze seemed to be exceptionally clear and bright, and there wasn't any obvious hostility within it, causing Lu Qin to be unable to determine the reason for her arrival from her gaze and expression. He could only smile and say, "Miss Song, may I know why you've come here?" Song Wenji was silent for a moment, and then opened her mouth to say to Lu Qin, "This house is mine." Lu Qin coughed and said, "Then I'm sorry, we heard that there is an important figure of the devil cult hiding here, so—" Song Wenji suddenly interrupted him and said, "You can do whatever you want, I don't care. It's just that in this house, there is a place where my deceased sister's memorial tablet is placed. Wenji sincerely asks senior brother Lu, do not disturb the peace of the deceased." After saying this, her eyes drooped, and her face showed some sorrow, but she sincerely bowed to Lu Qin. Lu Qin was immediately startled. Chapter 5:16. After standing in silence for a moment, Lu Qin did not directly reply to Song Wenji. Instead he turned back to look at Shuang and Old Ma. The two of them had subtle expressions on their faces. Old Ma frowned while Shuang shook her head slightly. She looked a little unhappy. Lu Qin pondered for a moment, then reached out to help Song Wenji up. At this moment he was so close to her that he could feel Song Wenji's extraordinary charm and beauty. Even someone as determined as him could not help but feel his heart tremble. Perhaps this was the so-called beauty of the world. The closer one was to her, the more they could not help but be attracted? Such a thought flashed across Lu Chen's mind, but he immediately suppressed those strange thoughts in his mind. His eyes became clear in the blink of an eye. He took half a step back and said in a low voice, "Miss Song, you said this house is yours? Then do you know what is happening inside?" Song Wenji's eyes fluttered as she glanced at the house. At this moment, there were all kinds of sounds of fighting and screams coming from inside. Even though she was blocked by the high walls, she could still feel the intense battle going on inside the house. Presumably, it was a scene of blood splattering everywhere. Song Wenji's expression changed slightly as if she was hesitant. But in the end she still said to Lu Qin, "This matter can't be hidden in the end, so I might as well tell you now. As for you people from Fiyunji." Her voice paused as if she did not know what to say for a moment. Lu Qin sighed in his heart. After staring at this charming woman for a moment he said, "We received a secret report saying that the remnants of the evil sect, Elder Gue and the others, may be hiding in this house." Shuang and Old Ma stood to the side, their gazes also fixed on this woman, waiting to see what kind of reaction she would have after hearing these words. After hearing Lu Chen's words, Song Wenji's gaze dropped, her eyes drifting. It was unknown whether she was looking at the ground in front of her or at Lu Chen's legs. However, the expression on her face did not seem to change, as if what Lu Chen had said just now had no effect on her. After a while, Song Wenji said calmly, "Senior Lu, I really do not know about this. I did ask someone to buy this house back then, but because it was a little inconvenient, I hit a corner in the middle. Of course, if you really want to investigate, these things can't be hidden from you, so I don't have anything to hide. But I really have nothing to do with the evil sect. I don't usually live here. I only arrange people to clean it from time to time. If there really are evil sect people inside, then there must be something wrong with the people guarding here." After hearing these words, Shuang and the others frowned. Shuang and Qin did not have any intention to speak. However, both Shui and Lu Qin did not say anything and looked at Ing looked. Old Ma was a little helpless, but he could only cough and then said to Song Wenji, "Well, Miss Song, it's like this. Although you just explained it to me, this matter is of great importance and it's really not good to just let it go." "And your explanation," said Song Wenji. "To be honest, it's not easy to explain." Song Wenji's bright eyes flashed. She looked at Old Ma and said, "But what I said is the truth." Old Ma hesitated for a moment, then finally clenched his teeth and said, Qin, I have to ask you something. Please answer me truthfully." Song Wenji saw that he was serious and also became serious. "Please speak. You bought this house, but the money was paid for by your foster father? Was it Taihu Supreme who asked you to buy this house?" Song Wenji's expression suddenly changed. A hint of coldness appeared on her face. She did not answer immediately but stared coldly at Old Ma. Old Ma's expression was the same as usual, as if he did not feel anything strange. However, he could faintly feel a trace of bitterness at the corner of his mouth. The atmosphere suddenly became somewhat stiff. For a moment no one spoke. After a while, Song Wenji coldly said, "What do you mean by asking this question?" Old Ma smiled awkwardly and said, "This is something that must be asked. After all, you are Taihu Supreme's foster daughter. We have to clarify the relationship between you and him in this matter." Saying this, he couldn't help but add, "No other intention. No other intention would be absurd." The four people present all understood in their hearts that this question was so obvious, the meaning was obvious without asking. However, even though Song Wenji looked incomparably angry, she did not have the intention to act impulsively. She only silently stood there, coldly watching. Finally, she slowly said, "This matter has nothing to do with foster father." Probably this answer was exactly the same as what everyone had guessed she would say. That was why no one revealed any strange expressions. Instead, Lu Qin at this moment suddenly raised his eyebrows. His gaze passed over Song Wenji's shoulder and looked at the distant street. Suddenly, a tall and sturdy figure appeared. That shiny bald head waved at him from afar. After a moment, that person walked into a house by the roadside. Lu Qin hesitated for a moment and then said to Song Wenji, "Miss Song, you don't have to be anxious. We, Fiyunji, are here to capture the evil faction evil people. We will not purposely disturb your sister's memorial tablet. But this matter is of great importance. You are after all the owner of the house. Why don't you wait here for a moment? As he spoke, he did not wait for Song Wenji's reply. It was as if he was certain that she would definitely stay here. He turned to Shuiying and said, Hallmaster, I will have to trouble you to accompany Miss Song for a moment. Once the fighting inside is over, we will go in and see if there are any evil people. The result will be clear at a glance. We will decide how to deal with them at that time. After speaking, he turned to Old Ma and said, You also wait here. I will be back soon. After speaking, he smiled at Song Wenji and walked straight into the distant street. Shuiying frowned as if somewhat puzzled. She wanted to say something but stopped. Song Wenji's expression changed. The three of them watched as Lu Chen walked into the distance. Then, for no reason, he turned a corner and walked directly into a house by the side of the street. Old Ma was startled and said, What is he doing there? Shuiying and Song Wenji did not speak. After a moment, the two women looked at each other and then turned to look at the house together, listening to the sounds of fighting that had already begun to die down. In the distance, Lu Chen pushed open the unlatched door and walked in. He closed the door behind him. The light in the house was somewhat dim. However, two figures could be seen standing in the house. One of them on the left was tall and burly with a shiny skull. Lu Chen glanced at him, then walked forward and bowed, saying, Master. This person was naturally perfected Lord Tianlan. He smiled and nodded slightly as a form of greeting. Then Lu Chen turned to look at the other side. He saw the old man with white hair and beard standing there calmly. He hesitated for a moment and looked at true Lord Tianlan again. Seeing that there was no strange expression on this damn bald man's face, Lu Chen secretly cursed in his heart. Then, with a respectful smile on his face, he went forward and bowed to the old man, saying, Disciple Lu Chen pays respect to true Lord Jianghu. Chapter 517. The sounds of fighting in the house finally calmed down. Although there were still a few screams and curses from time to time, they quickly stopped. It was unknown whether they were knocked unconscious or killed by blades and blood. On the long street outside the gate, the three people without Lu Chen became very quiet. No one spoke and the atmosphere was very stiff. However, after hearing the sounds gradually disappear, Shuiying finally snorted and said, Let's go in. After saying that, she was about to walk into the house. At this moment, Old Ma suddenly coughed and said, Lu Chen has returned. Shuiying and Song Wenji's footsteps paused and looked back. They saw that Lu Chen was indeed walking over from the distance. His figure was calm and his expression was calm. There seemed to be nothing strange about him. However, his eyes seemed to be faintly flickering, seemingly revealing some subtlety and strangeness. Shuiying frowned and was about to speak when she suddenly sensed something. She glanced to the side from the corner of her eyes and saw that although Song Wenji's expression was the same as usual, there seemed to be a faint feeling of relief. Shuiying's expression changed and suddenly became somewhat cold. After a while, Lu Chen walked in front of them and swept his gaze across their faces. In the end, his gaze lingered on Song Wenji's charming and moving face for a little longer. He then said calmly, This house was bought 2 years ago, right? The person who bought it was called Lu Hu. Song Wenji saw that Lu Chen seemed to be unable to say that name and hurriedly answered. Lu Chen glanced at her and smiled bitterly. He nodded and said, Yes, he's called Lu Hu, right? This person colluded with the devil cult and his crime is unforgivable. He should have been caught in this house by now. Let's go in and take a look. When the time comes, we definitely can't let this person go. When these words were spoken, the expressions on the faces of the people present immediately changed, each with their own interesting expressions. Song Wenji let out a long sigh and smiled sweetly, as beautiful as a spring flower. Old Ma was dumbstruck, his face full of astonishment, and he looked as if he could not believe his own ears, while Shuiying's reaction was the biggest. She was first surprised, then angry. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to say something, but then she snorted coldly, turned around and walked away with a cold face. Lu Chen hurriedly took a few steps forward and rushed to Shuiying's side. He whispered a few words to her, but Shuiying did not seem to be satisfied. She did not even soften her voice. Instead, she angrily said, Do you know how much risk we have taken? In the end, you let us go just like that? With that, she strode forward again. Lu Chen frowned and grabbed her wrist. Shuiying suddenly turned around, but before she could get angry, Lu Chen had already pulled her to the side, and then quickly whispered to her in an extremely low voice. Whether it was Song Wenji or Old Ma, They could not clearly hear what Lu Qin was saying at that moment. However, they could all see that the expression on Shui Ying's face was constantly changing, from anger and excitement at the beginning to loss and loss at the end. After a while, Lu Qin finished speaking and then gently let go of Shui Ying's wrist. With a slightly apologetic tone, he said, "In a moment of desperation, I have offended Hall Leader Shui. I am sorry." Shui Ying rubbed her wrist, but she did not seem to mind. She only closed her eyes slightly and revealed a bitter smile on her face. Then she said in a low voice, "We have fought so hard up front." Inside, she pointed in the direction of the large house to Lu Qin, and then said softly, "We do not know how many brothers in that house have been injured and lost their lives. But even so, is it still not comparable to a few casual words from the higher-ups?" Lu Qin was silent for a while, a sharp light flashing in the depths of his eyes. Then he said calmly, "Hall Leader Shui, you have been in this position for much longer than I have, and have seen far more of the world than I have. I believe this is not the first time you have seen something like this." He smiled and said, "Why make things difficult for me? I am only a small lackey to pass on the message." Shui Ying glanced at him, her eyes seemed to have a profound meaning, but after a while, all the expressions on her face disappeared. The anger, excitement, loss, bitterness and unwillingness seemed to have suddenly disappeared. In the blink of an eye, she seemed to have become that high and mighty woman who held great power. She nodded at Lu Qin and said, "I will naturally listen to the Lord True Monarch's orders." After saying this, she walked into the house that had already quietened down, but the smell of blood had begun to waft out. Lu Qin stood in the same place for a while when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw Old Ma and Song Wenji standing behind him. Lu Qin nodded at Old Ma and said, "Let's also go in and take a look." Old Ma agreed and the two of them walked towards the house. However, they had only taken 2 steps when Lu Qin suddenly stopped and looked back with some confusion. He saw that Song Wenji was actually still behind him. "Why are you still following us?" Lu Qin said to her, "Did I say it very clearly just now? Us catching Lu who has nothing to do with you." Song Wenji nodded and said softly, "Yes, I understand. Thank you, Senior Brother Lu. Wenji is very grateful." Lu Qin sighed and said, "You don't need to thank me, I can't accept it. What I mean is, since you have nothing to do here, you don't need to go in. Otherwise, if other people saw you, wouldn't it be troublesome?" Song Wenji hesitated for a moment and said, "I understand that Senior Brother Lu is good to me. In fact, I have no intention of deliberately making things difficult for you. I just want to go in and take back my sister's memorial tablet and ashes. I don't want her to be disturbed after her death." She looked deeply at Lu Qin and with a pleading expression she bowed and said, "Wenji knows that this is an inappropriate request. I only hope that Senior Brother Lu can help me. After all, my sister used to be my only relative. She raised me with her own hands. I owe her a favor that I can't repay in this lifetime." Lu Qin was speechless for a moment. He looked back at Old Ma, but unexpectedly, Old Ma turned his head away and looked elsewhere as if nothing had happened. It was clear that he didn't want to get involved in this matter. Lu Qin smiled bitterly and looked at Song Wenji again. He saw that this woman was looking at him with an earnest face. Her eyes were as clear as a child's, and seemed to be shining with the light of desire and expectation. Was that the remnant light of her initial innocence? Was that the last bit of warmth in her memory? For some reason, Lu Qin couldn't bring himself to say the words that he should have refused. It was probably because he was thinking of the woman from many, many years ago, when his heart was still as hard as stone, and the woman whose face was already blurred in his memory. Finally, he nodded and said softly, "All right, you come with me. After you find your sister's things, take them and leave quickly. Otherwise, if there are any accidents, I'm afraid you will also be in trouble." Song Wenji suddenly smiled. She looked very happy, gratified and happy. Her smile seemed to be as innocent as Lu Qin's, and there was no other meaning in his words. Chapter 518. Walking through the gate, they could feel the smell of blood thickening. There were no signs of a fierce fight in the front yard, but the further they walked, all kinds of blood stains, collapsed doors and windows, broken stones, and even some bloodied corpses began to appear in their line of sight. It was obvious that this group of elites sent by Fuyunji did not have the slightest hesitation or mercy after receiving the order. Shui Ying was already walking in front, while Lu Qin and Old Ma walked behind with Song Wenji. In the middle, Lu Qin glanced at Song Wenji's expression from the corner of his eye, but found that this young and charming woman's expression was the same as usual, as if she was not affected by the surrounding scene at all. Perhaps because they had been together for more than 10 years, they had developed a tacit understanding. At this time Old Ma turned to Song Wenji and said with a smile, "Miss Song, do you know these dead people next to you?" Song Wenji's expression did not change and she did not hesitate to think. Very calmly she said, "I don't know. When I was introduced to Lu Hu, I felt that he could do things, so I let him take care of this place. I don't know anyone here, they were all recruited by Lu Hu. The only connection I have with this place is that my sister's memorial tablet is still here." Old Ma and Lu Chen looked at each other, nodded, and did not say anything. In fact, there was nothing to say. She had already pushed the blame so cleanly in one breath, what else could they pursue? If it was a normal day they would naturally have many ways to pursue the matter, but at this moment, this beautiful woman had an even bigger backer behind her, so whatever she said, it was up to her. After walking for a while, Song Wenji opened her mouth and pointed in a direction, saying that her sister's memorial tablet was placed in a quiet room on the other side. Lu Chen then let Old Ma lead him there. Unexpectedly, Old Ma was unwilling, only saying that there were many things ahead, and his identity was different from Lu Chen's. Lu Chen could walk freely, but if Old Ma slipped away halfway and was caught by some big shot in Fuyunji, he might suffer a lot. Lu Chen also felt a little helpless. Although he knew that Old Ma's words were mostly evasive, he could not say that what he said was unreasonable, so he could only wave his hand and let him go. Song Wenji still needed someone to follow her. Although Lu Chen didn't know what Immortal Jianghu had said to the damn Baldi or what kind of deal they had reached to make Immortal Tianlan let them off, he didn't dare to let Song Wenji act alone in this house as the matter was a little delicate. However, in the following time, it seemed that Lu Chen's worry was unnecessary. Song Wenji could not be more normal. From the beginning to the end, she was very obedient, walking with Lu Chen, never leaving Lu Chen's sight, and did not make any suspicious movements. They walked all the way to the quiet room she mentioned, and then, under the gaze of Lu Chen, went in and took out a small urn and the wooden tablet of the memorial tablet. Lu Chen glanced at the wooden tablet and looked at the row of words on it with a calm expression. Then he looked away and said calmly, "Have you got them?" Song Wenji nodded and said, "These are the two things. Thank you, senior brother Lu. Wenji is very grateful." Lu Chen smiled and said, "You're welcome. Since you've got the things, it's not suitable for you to stay here for long in this bloody place, so you should leave first." Song Wenji replied with a N, carried the small urn and the tablet and walked out. Lu Chen followed behind her. He had only walked a few steps when he suddenly saw a figure turning the corner in front of him. The figure was tall and slender, and the two of them immediately met. It was actually Su Qingjun. Su Qingjun also did not expect to meet the two of them here. Looking at Lu Chen and Song Wenji, and then her eyes also saw the few things in Song Wenji's arms, she could not help but was startled, and her face revealed a strange expression. Song Wenji's expression right now was calm, and seemed to have some sorrow. Seeing Su Qingjun, she did not have any change, only nodded to her and walked over. Lu Chen for a moment felt a headache, but the matter was right in front of him. After thinking about it, he still had to follow. When he passed by Su Qingjun, he softly said, "There are evil faction heretics here, be careful." Su Qingjun snorted, with some unhappiness on her face, lightly said, "When I was fighting with the evil faction heretics, I did not see you, so you came here." Lu Chen smiled bitterly, wanted to explain, but in the end he shook his head and walked over, and just like that, sent Song Wenji out of the house. After Song Wenji went out, she purposely stopped, turned and smiled at Lu Chen and then said, "This time I really have to thank Lu senior brother for your help." Lu Chen said, "Don't mention it, our relationship as elders is there, it is what I should do." Relationship. Song Wenji muttered, suddenly laughed, but she quickly calmed down, bowed to Lu Chen and turned to leave. But after a few steps she suddenly turned back and said to Lu Chen, "If you need me to explain to that sister Su, Lu Chen senior brother, feel free to tell me." Lu Chen rolled his eyes, sternly said, "There is no such thing. I walk straight and sit upright, an upright body is not afraid of crooked shadows, there is nothing to explain." After a pause he added, "Oh, that Su Qingjun and I actually do not have any special relationship, don't think too much so as not to hurt her reputation." Song Wenji smiled. She didn't say anything and just floated away. Lu Chen looked at her back for a while, then turned around and walked back into the house. When he passed by the intersection, he purposely looked at the place where they had met, only to see that it was empty, there was no one there. At this time there were basically no sounds of fighting in the house, but all kinds of noises and shouts were much more than before, rising and falling, gathering in the backyard of the house, occasionally accompanied by a few screams, but they quickly disappeared. Lu Chen quickened his pace and walked towards the backyard. The stench of blood in the air was getting thicker and thicker, and along the way there were corpses strewn all over the place. Just as he was about to see the gate to the backyard, he suddenly heard a loud noise in front of him, as if many people were exclaiming in unison, and then excited voices could be heard. "Here, here. There is a secret door, quickly open it. No hurry, be careful of the traps, surround the surroundings first. Where is the trap master? Quickly come and take a look. Hurry, hurry, it's open, it's open." Ah! Suddenly, a scream came from that direction. The voice was mournful, followed by a loud shout, "Be careful, there is someone inside. Someone is hiding inside. Is it a big fish? It is not a big fish, maybe it is a big turtle." Finally, someone suddenly said, and the backyard suddenly became silent. After a moment, suddenly there was a burst of laughter, with endless joy, gratification, and excitement. Chapter 5:19. Even though they were far away, the cheers from the mansion could be faintly heard from the end of the long street. Ordinary people could not hear it clearly, but for divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, as long as they paid attention, they would naturally know what was going on. In the dim room, perfected Lord Tianlan and perfected Lord Jianghu had already sat down. When there were no outsiders present, the two of them seemed to be much more casual. They did not really care whether they were sitting on an ordinary wooden chair or a throne or a lotus seat in one of the lofty palaces on Sky Dragon Mountain. However, the room was still very quiet. Neither of them spoke, and it was precisely because of this that the burst of cheers sounded a little clearer. After a while, perfected Lord Jianghu suddenly broke the silence and said, "Do you think that the person we caught is Elder Ghost?" Perfected Lord Tianlan thought for a while, then shook his head and said, "Probably not. If that guy was caught so easily, he wouldn't have been able to hide from us for decades in the Immortal City." Perfected Lord Jianghu nodded slowly, seemingly agreeing with perfected Lord Tianlan's words. After a while, there was a sudden sound of footsteps outside the room. The two important figures in the room did not seem to have any reaction. After a while, the footsteps stopped outside the door, and then someone knocked lightly on the unlatched door 3 times. "Come in," perfected Lord Jianghu said. The wooden door was pushed open with a creak and Song Wenji walked in. She first called perfected Lord Jianghu Godfather, then turned her head and looked at perfected Lord Tianlan. Even though he was just sitting, perfected Lord Tianlan's tall and sturdy figure was still very astonishing. At first glance he seemed to be slightly taller than the petite Song Wenji. At the same time, this bald perfected lord had an extremely imposing manner. He was not angry, but his eyes were as deep as the sea, and seemed to contain wind and thunder. He really was like a god. Song Wenji did not know if she was intimidated by the imposing manner of the number 1 person in Zhengxianming, but there was a strange expression on her face. She seemed to be afraid, but at the same time she seemed to be worshipping and admiring him. Perhaps this was the common emotion that every ordinary person had when facing the gods and Buddhas. Even the practitioners with cultivation were no exception. She respectfully bowed to perfected Lord Tianlan and said softly, "Disciple Wenji pays respect to perfected Lord Tianlan." Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression was calm. His gaze lingered on the charming woman for a moment before he nodded. "Get up." "Yes." Song Wenji stood up and silently walked to the side of Supreme Jianghu. She stood a step behind him. After a while, she could not help but lift her eyes and look at Supreme Tianlan, who was not far away. When Song Wenji walked in, she was still holding her deceased sister's ashes and memorial tablet. However, both Supreme Jianghu and Supreme Tianlan did not care about this. Only Supreme Jianghu asked her lightly, "How is it in the house? Did anyone make things difficult for you?" Song Wenji replied, "Many people died. They are trying to catch the demons of the devil sect. Senior brother Lu Qin treated me very well. He followed Lord True Monarch Tianlan's instructions and protected me. He even agreed to some of my unreasonable requests and even personally escorted me out." True Monarch Jianghu nodded and glanced at True Monarch Tianlan. True Monarch Tianlan smiled and said, "I was right, right? That kid is reliable." Supreme Jianghu snorted and said, "He is very good. But I thought you would tell Shuang. I didn't expect you to only look for your own disciple. Are you really going to train a successor?" Standing beside Supreme Jianghu, Song Wenji lowered her gaze. But after hearing this, a ray of light flashed across her eyes and she quickly calmed down. Supreme Tianlan smiled and said, "If I don't train him, why would I take him in as a disciple? As for you, old Jianghu, although you have taken in quite a few disciples these years, I know you are not particularly satisfied with them. Now that you're old, Could it be that you want to pass on your legacy to your goddaughter? Steel Pot True Lord sneered, rolled his eyes and said, "You talk too much. How I decide on this matter has nothing to do with you." Supreme Tianlan laughed and pointed at Song Wenji. "Let's not talk about other things. This little girl's aptitude is top-notch. She looks good. How about this? If you don't want to marry her, I will ask for your hand in marriage and betroth her to my disciple Lu Chen. How about that?" Once these words were spoken, the room immediately became silent. Both Taihu deity and Song Wenji revealed a stunned expression. The only difference was Taihu deity looked surprised with some anger, while Song Wenji, with a perfect amount of shyness, in the deepest part of her eyes, a trace of sadness gently flashed past. After a while, Supreme Tiehu snorted and waved his hand to reprimand, "Don't give me that. Don't think that you can push your luck just because you have the upper hand today. Let me tell you, Wenji is my most beloved daughter. She's a priceless treasure to me. Even if you give me the most precious treasure in the world, I won't do it, not to mention giving her back to your disciple as his wife. You'd better give up on this idea." Supreme Tianlan shook his head and smiled. He turned to look at Song Wenji and said, "You are really stingy. You talk big, but why don't you listen to what the little girl is thinking? What if she likes my disciple?" As he said this, he drew a big circle in front of him and said with a smile, "Little girl, let me tell you, in the future all my properties may be passed on to Lu Chen. If you marry him, you won't have to worry about anything for the rest of your life. How about it, are you willing?" Supreme Tiehu looked a little annoyed, but he seemed to have thought of something. He turned his head and looked at Song Wenji suspiciously, saying, "Wenji, what are you thinking?" Song Wenji bit her lips and knelt down in front of Supreme Tiehu. She said, "Godfather, you have done so much for me. Without you there would be no Wenji. Wenji has no request. I only wish to serve Godfather for the rest of my life. I only hope that Godfather will take pity on me and not drive me away. Otherwise I can only be a lonely soul with no one to rely on." At the end of her words, her shoulders trembled and her body trembled. She seemed to be crying as if she was very sad. Supreme Tiehu was shocked. He quickly stood up and helped Song Wenji up. Her face was full of tears, like a pear blossom in the rain. True Monarch Tai, whose face revealed a pained expression as he said, "Why did you do this? Why did you do this? My dear daughter, don't cry. I have no such intention, no such intention." As he said that, he turned around and glared at perfected Lord Tianlan, saying angrily, "You're a perfected lord after all. How dare you spout such frivolous words to scare my obedient daughter?" True Lord Tianlan stared deeply at True Lord Tiehu, only to see him hurriedly comforting the crying Song Wenji. His expression was anxious, and he did not have the bearing of a spirit-severing true lord at all. Supreme Tianlan was amused. He let out a sigh of relief and apologized with a smile. He then stood up and walked out of the house, leaving the godfather and goddaughter alone. True Lord Tianlan looked at the sky as he stood on the long street. Then he looked at the bustling house in the distance and the sounds of fierce fighting that once again rang out. He also heard the comforting words coming from the house behind him. A deep smile appeared on his face. With his hands behind his back, he looked up at the sky. At that moment he felt that all the living beings in the world were probably just mediocre people. With a flip of the palm, the clouds and rain were overturned. There were few difficult things in the world. Chapter 520. Lu Chen saw the secret door. It was in the back garden of the mansion under a rockery. It seemed to have blended in with the surrounding rocks and plants. It was almost flawless, and ordinary people would not be able to discover it at all. But it was a pity that the group of people who surrounded this place today were not ordinary people. In the long history of fighting with the devil sect, Fuyunji had long developed from an unknown small sect of Zhangxianming to a huge, terrifying, and even somewhat abnormal powerful organization. In the Fuyun division, apart from the most famous cultivator assassins and the ever-present and mysterious shadow, there were also all kinds of talents, including astronomy, geography, metaphysics, mechanisms, geomancy, and so on. They had everything you could think of. On such an important day, and also in the immortal city where the headquarters of Zhangxianming and Fuyunji were located, there was no lack of talents. Therefore, this ingeniously hidden secret door did not hide for long before it was discovered by the people in Fuyunji who specialized in this field. At this moment, the fighting in other places in the house had basically stopped. Although the situation was tragic, blood splattered everywhere, corpses were everywhere, but the winner was undoubtedly Fuyunji. In the immortal city, if there was an open battle, the forces that wanted to fight against Zhangxianming and Fuyunji was tantamount to a fool's dream, seeking their own death. As a result, the people of the Floating Clouds Agency had already filled up this back garden. At a glance, one could see a dense crowd of cultivators. Countless of them held blood-stained weapons, and their bodies were covered in blood. Their expressions were either solemn, excited, or ferocious. They all had blood-stained smiles on their faces as they surrounded the secret door. The so-called unable to escape even if given wings, was probably like this. The entrance of the secret room was very narrow. This was also a common characteristic of most secret rooms in the world, although there were many people in Fuyunji, but due to the terrain they could not swarm in. Probably because of this, until now the people in the secret room were still stubbornly resisting. Fuyunji's men rushed in a few times, but the resistance from the people inside was unusually fierce. They managed to repel them several times. Even though they knew that the outside was already surrounded, the people inside didn't seem to have any intention of surrendering. Perhaps they felt that even if they surrendered, there wouldn't be a better result? Although this made the people of Fuyunji a little angry, a few of the leaders revealed a trace of joy in their eyes. It seemed that they had indeed blocked a big fish this time. After fighting for a while longer, Fuyunji's attacks were repelled twice, and some of their players were injured. This time the expressions of Shuaying and the others turned somewhat ugly. Lu Chen also walked to her side and said softly, "Don't think too much. If he wanted to die, he would have killed himself long ago. Just use those methods on him and force him out." Shuaying pondered for a moment and nodded. She casually waved her hand and summoned a nearby subordinate. Then, she whispered a few orders and the subordinate immediately turned and ran away. After that, Shuaying acted as if nothing had happened. She whispered in a voice that only Lu Chen could hear, "Is the true lord outside?" "Yes, he's outside watching," Lu Chen said. "Oh," Shuaying responded, seeming to let out a sigh of relief. Lu Chen smiled at her and didn't say anything else. Not long after, there was a commotion in the crowd in front of them. After a while it seemed like someone shouted a few words. Then there was a rustling sound and an empty space appeared in the middle of the crowd, which happened to be near the secret door. Then 4 or 5 people walked up, each holding a large lump of something in their hands. They slowly walked to a place not far from the door of the secret room. The secret room was silent, and the atmosphere seemed to be somewhat tense. Someone in the crowd suddenly laughed. Then, as if it was contagious, this hearty and mocking laughter suddenly rang out everywhere, vaguely carrying a hint of tyranny. After a while, among the people at the door of the secret room, one of them acted first. He quickly threw 5 or 6 black ball-shaped objects into the secret room from a distance. There was an angry roar in the secret room. But very quickly, almost in the blink of an eye, this angry roar was drowned out by a violent explosion. A blazing flame suddenly lit up, and the orange flame even rushed out of the secret door halfway. A wave of heat rolled and drifted, making it even more difficult to imagine the scene in the secret room. Shuaying and Lu Chen's expressions didn't change, as if they didn't have any emotions. But when Lu Chen turned to look, he found that among the Fuyunji experts in the crowd in front, about half of them had happy smiles on their faces. It was probably because of this that Lu Chen quickly found a girl in the crowd who didn't fit in with the others. Su Qingjun stood in the crowd, frowning slightly. She stared at the flames in the secret room for a moment, then gritted her teeth and turned her head away. Then, as if she felt something, she looked in Lu Chen's direction and saw Lu Chen staring at her. Su Qingjun was startled, but in the end she didn't say anything. She just silently walked backwards. There were no miserable screams coming from the secret room that was filled with flames. After a while, this caused the surrounding Fuyunji people to feel a little restless. Shuaying snorted and waved her hand again as if she was giving an order. The people in front of the door immediately moved, taking turns to walk forward, and then very skillfully threw the things in their hands into the secret room. Thus, in this lonely and despairing secret room, apart from the raging flames, there was also poisonous water, bone-corroding black sand, floating poisonous gas that could rot from the mouth to the lungs, and other things that could make one's scalp go numb and die a horrible death. Seeing this, even the gratified and happy laughter in the surroundings slowly quieted down. Everyone stared at the secret door that no one had rushed out of until now, their faces gradually showing expressions of disbelief. "That's right, do you keep a dog?" Behind the crowd, Lu Chen suddenly asked Shuaying this somewhat incomprehensible question. Shuaying was startled for a moment and looked at Lu Chen with some surprise, then said, "No, why?" Lu Chen said, "It's nothing, I just wanted to tell you that Sir Iron Pot True Monarch is magnanimous. After I personally asked him, he agreed to take back the dog prohibition order." Shui was a little speechless and didn't know what to say for a moment. What did this dog prohibition order have to do with today's matter? Right at this moment, an angry roar suddenly came from the deathly silent secret chamber. A moment later, the stone walls around the secret chamber's entrance instantly exploded, shooting out witchcraft gravel and exploding in all directions. In the midst of the chaos, a black silhouette mixed in the gravel shot up into the sky, but it was escaping towards the sky. Lu Qin and Shui raised their heads and glanced at the sky, but their bodies didn't move at all. The sky was clear and bright. But in the next moment, the sky suddenly darkened. It was as if a hand had suddenly covered the sky, and there was no peace. Chapter 521. Covering the sky with one hand. A palm really fell from the sky. It was unimaginably huge, covering the sky and the sun. It was as if at that moment not only the back garden but the entire house, the long street outside, and even the nearby large area of the immortal city had suddenly darkened. It was like the wrath of the gods in heaven, with a ruthless and unparalleled power, descending from the sky and suppressing everything. The black shadow that soared into the sky from the back garden suddenly lost all escape routes, and was faced with endless darkness. And on the ground, all the Fuyunji experts who had reacted at the first moment and were ready to fly up and intercept the escaping black shadow, at this moment, one by one, stopped in their tracks and looked up at the sky with awe. That tall and burly figure that was like a god, unknowingly, was already standing in the sky at the peak of the clouds, looking down at the world high and mighty. The black shadow that originally soared into the sky with a trace of desperation and madness, fell into a predicament where there was no way forward or retreat. There was no way up to the sky and no way down to the ground. In the last moment of despair, he let out a long roar, and used all his strength to collide with the giant palm that was descending from the sky. The wind and clouds suddenly became urgent, the wind whistled from all directions and the dark clouds in the sky rolled. Suddenly there was a sound of thunder, and a bolt of lightning that tore the sky apart appeared between the fingers of the giant palm. Like a long white snake, it slithered on the giant palm, and then revealed a ferocious and disdainful grin at the black shadow that was rushing towards it. In an instant, the light of the lightning flourished, and the heaven and earth were silent. The giant palm came crashing down, bringing with it rolling wind and thunder, and slapped on the black shadow that soared into the sky. There was only a roar, and there seemed to be a wave of air that instantly burst forth in mid-air, and immediately rushed towards the surroundings like a huge wave. The giant palm lifted slightly and paused in mid-air for a moment. And under the shadow of the giant palm, the black shadow, as if it had suffered a heavy blow, its entire body flew backwards, like a falling stone, flying diagonally faster and faster. In a short moment, it heavily smashed onto the ground, making a loud sound, and then there was a burst of rustling sounds. The black shadow couldn't control its momentum at all. It tumbled on the ground, smashing through 3 or 4 houses and even leaving a deep mark on the ground. If it was an ordinary person, they would have been smashed into smithereens. However, reality was not like that. But under such a terrifyingly powerful palm, no matter how high the black figure's cultivation was, he was instantly defeated. He fell in the ruins and never got up again. The experts of the Floating Clouds Agency, who were originally in the back garden, rushed over. In just a few moments they had surrounded the black figure. All kinds of dazzling techniques were used, and in an instant the black figure was suppressed to the point where he couldn't move at all. With that, the outcome was set. The final thief was finally caught. The members of the Floating Clouds Agency all revealed excited smiles. Even more people raised their heads to look at the sky. When they looked at the godlike figure high up in the sky, their faces revealed expressions of reverence. And the bald burly man above the clouds, at this moment, his expression was calm. He only indifferently glanced at the chaotic situation on the ground, then slowly raised his eyes and looked towards the distant horizon. He frowned slightly as if thinking about something. On the ground, Shuiying and Lu Qin, who stood behind the crowd, didn't rush up to surround and interrogate the black figure like the others. Instead, they stood there without moving, their expressions a little strange. After a moment, they seemed to look at each other at the same time but didn't speak. They just stood there silently. Lu Qin also frowned slightly. This black figure's cultivation was profound and his strength was valiant. He was a strong enemy that was difficult to deal with. But if everyone's target was the Ghost Elder who had fought with Supreme Tianlan and Fuyunji in the Immortal City for decades, it seemed to be a little weak. Was the Ghost Elder only at this level? Or could it be that this time that crafty and treacherous old turtle was once again hiding in some dark corner, continuing his evil deeds? The battle between the evil cult and the Fuyunsi was still not over, it was still going to continue painfully like this. In the underground city that was shrouded by the blood-red brilliance of the blood moon, Supreme Guyu expressionlessly walked out from the big house. Standing at the door, he paused for a moment as if he sensed something. He raised his head and glanced at the sky. What entered his eyes was a strange blood moon that was surrounded by red light and shadows. But his gaze didn't seem to stop at that thing. After pausing on the blood moon for a moment, he looked further away. Passing through the blood moon was a solid and thick rock wall, and further away was the ground of the human world. That place seemed to be another world, and above it was a layer of real sky. The wind and clouds swirled. The person whose power shook the four directions was standing above the 9 heavens. Supreme Guyu's expression at this moment became somewhat complicated. He seemed to be deep in thought, and then quietly sat down on the stone steps at the door. In the huge city, on the long and empty streets, there was only his figure, looking like a lone shadow, extremely lonely. The blood light floated, sprinkled on his body and also into the house behind him. In the backyard separated by a wall, in the dried-up well, a shadow hidden in the deepest part of the darkness slowly moved. He raised his head and glanced at that small well, and heaved a long sigh of relief. Then he seemed to hesitate, but in the end he still stood up, using his hands and feet to pat the hard walls of the well. His entire body then quietly climbed up the well wall. There was no sound of wind as the figure moved, no movement at all. This black figure silently and slowly climbed to the mouth of the dry well. The blood moon in the sky sprinkled down blood-red light, onto the well, onto his body. The red light floated up and down, like waves in a blood ocean, clustered his figure in the light and shadow. That black shadow let out a low sigh of satisfaction, deeply breathed in this air that even the smell seemed to carry the stench of blood, and then looked up at the blood moon in the sky and slowly poked his head out. In the red blood light, the face that poked out of the well was impressively a sinister mask. Only the 2 eye sockets were 2 holes, and 2 dark red lights could be seen flickering in them. Not far away, outside the door separated by a wall, Supreme Guyu also quietly sat, looking up as if he did not feel anything. In that small house on the long street of the Immortal City, the doors and windows were opened. Tai Hu Tru and Song Wenji stood in front of the window, and saw the entire scene in the sky. When the gigantic palm with unparalleled power defeated the black shadow that soared to the sky, True Lord Tiehu frowned, while Song Wenji, who was standing beside him, revealed a complicated expression. A trace of reverence first appeared in the depths of her eyes. Perhaps that was the feeling of every cultivator when facing such a powerful force that stood at the peak of the human cultivation world. Then she revealed a trace of worry and turned to look at Supreme Tai Hu Tru. Supreme Tai Hu Tru seemed to feel the worried gaze of his goddaughter, and turned to her, forcing a smile. Song Wenji was a little hesitant but finally said in a low voice, "Godfather Supreme Tianlan He is very strong." Supreme Tai Hu Tru was silent for a moment and suddenly sneered, his face revealing an arrogant expression, and said, "Not bad, but at my level who cannot do this? This person is frivolous and purposely wants to show off to the world for an undeserved reputation, and is only SOSO. After speaking, he turned and walked away. Song Wenji took one last look at the figure in the sky outside the house. The corner of her mouth slightly revealed an imperceptible smile, and hurriedly followed Supreme Tai Hu Tru. Chapter 522. Chen He, who was in the crowd, squeezed through the people around him and walked out. His face was ashen as he turned to look at his surroundings. He quickly found Shuiying and Lu Qin, who were standing behind the crowd and had not come over to join in the fun. He stood where he was and hesitated for a moment. Then he walked over with an ugly expression. He even had to take a deep breath to calm himself down before saying to the 2 of them in a deep voice, "That is not Elder Gue." Shuiying and Lu Qin looked at him and did not say anything. After a moment of silence, Qin He said, "That person is called Fan Tue. He is the leader of the demon sect in the Western continent. He has been doing well over the years and is highly regarded by Elder Gue. He was deployed to the Celestial City with the intention of nurturing and putting him in an important position." Qin He did not finish his sentence because the outcome was right before his eyes. Clearly this high-ranking member of the demon sect, Fan Tue, was very unlucky. It was an important opportunity for him to achieve meteoric success. However, he had coincidentally encountered a series of heavy blows to the demon sect from Fuyunji. It was naturally impossible for him to achieve his ambitions now. He was even forced to hide here and was eventually captured alive. It could be said that he was unlucky. However, there was no joy on the faces of Lu Chen and Shui Ying. The two of them looked at each other and saw a hint of worry and disappointment in their eyes. Their most important and biggest target, Elder Gue, who was the key to completely destroying the demon sect, where was he hiding? Could it be that this sinister and cunning enemy who had fought with the people of Fuyunji for decades, would still be pestering Zhang Xianming in the Celestial City? Even though perfected Lord Tianlan had clearly held back and did not kill Fan Tue, it was not easy to fall into the hands of a divine transformation stage perfected lord, someone who had the power to be Zhang Xianming or even the most powerful person in the world. Fan Tue faced this divine transformation stage perfected lord head-on and was defeated on the spot. Even though he did not die on the spot, his internal organs were shaken and his meridians were in a mess. He fainted on the spot and remained unconscious for 3 days and 3 nights. During this period, Fuyunji had brought people back to Mount Tianlong. Of course, it was not just Fan Tue. There were also other demons from the demon sect that were captured in the house. Harboring evildoers of the devil cult was a serious crime. Of course, the owner of the house had to be held accountable, because it was very likely that the owner of the house was inextricably linked to the devil cult. He might even be a member of the devil cult. Due to various reasons, the original owner of the house disappeared from sight, and all the blame was placed on a man named Lu Hu. Everyone soon discovered that this man had died in that fierce battle in a corner of the house. Then everything was perfect. The only and had not had the demon sect and had and had and had and had and had and had. In the end, the demon sect was still weak. Given the situation, those who had escaped would not be able to overturn the situation. After this vigorous but peaceful encirclement, peace was restored on Mount Tianlong. After all, without capturing Elder Ghost, it could not be said that the evil cult had been completely destroyed. Therefore, the original days were still going on as usual. At most, there were more people in the prison who were prepared to interrogate and investigate. However, in Zhang Xianming there were still some changes that were discovered. The relationship between the two major factions in Zhang Xianming, the Heavenly Law Hall and Fuyunji, seemed to have eased recently. Although the two high and mighty perfected cultivators in the divinity transformation stage did not show up and directly say anything, smart people and conscientious people were the last things that were lacking in such a powerful organization as Zhang Xianming. They had been paying attention to the situation in the Alliance of Immortals all the time, carefully searching for every opportunity and trend that might affect them. And for so many years the news in Zhang Xianming could not be completely kept secret. Everyone felt that it was like a sieve that leaked information everywhere. In fact, it was indeed a sieve. Speaking of which, it was a very interesting thing. Even if one was as strong as a perfected lord of the soul formation stage, even if his name shook the world and his prestige shook the celestial city, no matter how strong he was or how powerful he was still powerless against things like rumors. This was probably the reason why the human heart could never be controlled. But fortunately, there were too many smart people in this world. Since they could not control the rumors, they would instead add vinegar to the rumors and release more confusing words that made it difficult to distinguish between truth and falsehood. Naturally, they could also make people confused and at a loss for what to do. Therefore, during this period of time, Mount Celestial Dragon looked peaceful, but the rumors in private were like waves, coming wave after wave. Today it was the Fuyun division that suffered a great loss and was fooled by Elder Ghost, so they didn't manage to catch the culprit. Tomorrow, it was the true Lord Tianlan's ingenious plan and meticulous arrangement that defeated the last force of the devil cult in the Celestial City in one fell swoop. The day after that, there was someone who stood out and said with certainty that the reason why this battle was so successful was because true Lord Tai Hu and true Lord Tianlan disregarded their former enmity and cooperated with each other sincerely. As expected, these few deity realm true lords were all great figures who cared about the world and placed the righteous path of the world above all. The rumors were like a mess of flowers, clouding people's eyes. It was hard to distinguish between truth and falsehood. But during this period of time, it was true that perfected Lord Tai Hu did not open his mouth to criticize or berate Fuyunji. Those who thought that the two factions had reconciled also used this as evidence. But in this chaos, there was a small matter that did not attract attention. At most, it was a piece of news that people found a little strange and then forgot about after hearing it. It was said that perfected Lord Tai Hu had passed down an order to withdraw the dog ban that was previously issued. Most of the cultivators in the world did not keep dogs. Very few cultivators who kept pets had to keep all kinds of different kinds of strange birds and beasts. The remaining number was really pitiful. So, when this dog ban was first issued, although it was surprising, it did not cause too much controversy in the Celestial City. Everyone treated it as if it did not exist. But now that it was suddenly cancelled, everyone just listened and laughed. Most people did not care and just thought that it was a sudden impulse of that perfected Lord Taihu. In any case, if you cultivated to the realm of perfected Lord of Deity transformation, of course you would be qualified to do this. However, only 4 people in this world knew that the reason why perfected Lord Taihu did this was because that day in the small house on the long street, after perfected Lord Tianlan and perfected Lord Taihu had reached an agreement on all the conditions, Lu Qin suddenly and very politely added this condition to perfected Lord Taihu. This suggestion seemed a little rude and unnecessary, but that was what Lu Qin said. And the strange thing was, perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to agree very much. Before perfected Lord Taihu lost his temper, he smilingly included this request in his own request, and also suppressed perfected Lord Taihu's temper. So, in the end, this huge pursuit ended silently. There was not much change in Lu Chen's life. The only one who benefited the most was a strong black dog. On that day the black dog was released and no longer restrained by anyone. It stood in front of the Kunlun temple with a proud and ecstatic expression, barking wildly outside for the whole morning. It was said that the entire Sky Dragon Mountain could hear the dogs barking. Later, the black dog was kicked out of the Kunlun temple by perfected Lord Tianlan, and was not allowed to enter again. Chapter 523. Although they did not manage to catch Elder Ghost in that arrest, but this operation was still like giving the evil faction, which was already on its last breath, a heavy stab, stabbing into the heart, hurting into the bones. From that day onwards, the ghost-like shadow that had been floating in the immortal city for many years finally quieted down. There was no more movement about the evil sect, nor any news related to Elder Ghost. Everything seemed to have sunk into the water, into the darkness, and from then on, there was no more sound. Most of the people thought that the evil sect's power was gone and there was no turning back. Shuiying, Lu Qin, Old Ma, and that Qin He who sought refuge all thought so. All the power was wiped out, even if Elder Ghost was still on the run, even if he still had a little possibility to stir up some waves in the future, but to rebuild the evil sect in front of such a powerful Zhang Xianmeng was still too difficult. Sky Dragon Mountain calmed down. Of course, that was only on the surface. In the era of prosperity, the undercurrent under the huge organization would never stop, there would always be all kinds of things happening. After eliminating the foreign enemies, it was time for everyone to plot against each other for their own interests. No, it could even be said that this era had already arrived. Everyone was already very familiar with the open and veiled struggles. The only difference was that in the past there was still Fiyunji. Because of the persistence of Lord Tianlan and some other reasons, he kept chasing and biting the evil sect like a mad dog. Relying on Lord Tianlan's rare talent, relying on Fiyunji's growing strength and all kinds of ruthless and decisive methods, the evil sect was slowly suppressed, and Zhang Xianmeng won the reputation of the world. Now it was a new era, it was time to do something else. For example, they would stab their partners who were also allies of the Immortal Alliance and the Righteous Path with a smile, snatch their business, curse them, spread rumors, and then criticize them righteously. In the end, once they gained power, they would kill their friends. Finally, this era had arrived. Have you been waiting for this day for a long time, or have you been resisting for this day to come? That day when Lu Qin and Lord Tianlan were chatting in the Kunlun Hall, he asked him directly. Lord Tianlan thought for a while, then said with indifference and arrogance, "Never thought about it. Anyway, with my current achievements, it should be others who plot against me, right?" Lu Qin did not believe a word he said. "Nonsense, I don't believe you when you say you don't plot against others." Lord Tianlan laughed and said, "Brat, can't you say something nice?" Lu Qin said, "Oh, master is kind, humble and gentle. You should be careful of the people in the Celestial Alliance who have evil intentions and want to harm you. You can't underestimate them." Lord Tianlan clapped and smiled, nodded and said, "Well said." Lu Qin rolled his eyes and said after pondering for a moment, "What should we do next?" Lord Tianlan said, "That old tortoise is hiding somewhere right now and refuses to come out no matter what. It's indeed hard to find, but we can't just give up. Don't bother about this for now and leave it to Shuiying and Fiyunji." Lu Qin nodded. Lord Tianlan continued, "I have something important that I need your help with and it has to be you." When Lu Qin saw Lord Tianlan retract his smile and turn solemn at this point, He could not help but be stunned. He sat up straight and nodded. What is it? Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced out of the hall and saw Mount Sky Dragon standing tall and majestic under the clear skies. He narrowed his eyes slightly with a deep gaze. After a moment he said, "Make a trip back to Kunlun on my behalf." The forest was quiet and the wind blew through the majestic mountain. In the quiet hall in the afternoon, there was only a soft and low voice that floated in the hall. It was like a strand of lonely wind that lingered and didn't fade away, and it was telling a secret that no one knew. Atsu lay lazily under the shade of a tree outside of Kunlun's hall. Its dog eyes were half closed and it looked like it was dozing off. However, when a familiar voice came from afar, Atsu's body quivered, and he immediately opened his eyes. His eyes were bright, and his drowsiness disappeared without a trace. Lu Qin stood on the stone steps and smiled at it, waving his hand. Atsu jumped up and ran over while barking. It rushed to Lu Qin's side and rubbed its head against his body intimately. Lu Qin patted its head and looked back at the majestic Kunlun's hall thoughtfully. A complicated expression appeared on his face. After a moment Lu Qin said, "Let's go, Atsu. We're going on a long trip." Since they were going on a long trip, it was impossible for them to leave just like that. Lu Qin first returned to his residence and tidied up before leaving for Fuyunji. It had been a long time since Atsu had followed him like this. However, this black dog did not seem to be unfamiliar to him. It ran back and forth and sniffed around just like before. Lu Qin arrived at Fuyunji's hall and asked someone to inform him. Not long after he saw Shuang. Shuang smiled when she saw him and said, "I haven't been here for a while. Let me tell you about catching Elder Gui. That old turtle is really cunning. I really don't know where he is hiding. However, we didn't come out empty-handed. 3 days ago." Lu Qin smiled and waved his hand. "Hall Master Shui, you can make the decision on this matter. I won't interfere. When it comes to dealing with the demonic cult, no one in the world can beat you. Even when Master ordered me to come over a while ago, it was just to help you from the side and help you balance the relationship with the new experts of the Kunlun party." Shuang was slightly startled. Her smile became even sweeter. She covered her mouth and said, "What are you saying? When did you learn to flatter?" Lu Qin laughed heartily and said, "Of course not. Alright, I came here today to say hello to Hall Master. The cultivation method that Master passed on to me is quite difficult. In the next few days, I have to go into seclusion in Kunlun's hall. I'm afraid that I can't manage the affairs of the outside world for a while. I can only come and trouble Hall Master Shui." Shuang raised her eyebrows. She then nodded and said, "I see. Cultivation is the duty of us cultivators. Your future is boundless. You carry the expectations of the monarch, so of course you have to put this matter first. As for the other mundane matters, let me handle them. You can rest assured and cultivate." Lu Qin smiled and cupped his hands. "Thank you very much." The two of them chatted for a while and handed over some of the chores during the conversation. Lu Qin then took his leave, turned a corner and found Old Ma again. He told him exactly what he had said. Old Ma looked very envious. He smiled and said, "Go and cultivate well. Maybe when you come out of seclusion, you will amaze the world with a single brilliant feat." Lu Qin smiled and said, "How can that be possible? Anyway, buy more wine when the time comes. Let's drink together." Old Ma laughed and agreed. Lu Qin left with Atsu. Along the way, intentionally or unintentionally, he passed by the outside of Su Qingjuan's residence. His gaze fell on the door for a long time. But in the end he walked over in silence. Just like that he returned to Kunlun's hall. He brought Atsu and sat in a quiet corner. When night came, darkness came from all directions. In the silence, Lu Qin blended into the shadows of darkness that he had not seen for a long time. Chapter 524. There was the sound of even breathing in the darkness. Being immersed in a dream in the quiet night was also a kind of unremarkable but in fact very beautiful happiness. However, some people were destined not to want this kind of dream. Even in the dead of night, she was like a vigilant kitten, carefully on guard. Once there was the slightest movement, she would immediately wake up. White Lotus was this kind of girl. She quietly sat up in the darkness and turned her head to look out the window. The night was quiet and deep like the sea. There seemed to be nothing but darkness, but it also seemed that behind the dark deep sea, there were countless shadows and ghosts, staring at this place in the middle of the night. White Lotus gently frowned and then turned her head. She heard the steady and quiet breathing of Su Qingjun in the same room. She was still in a dream, quietly and gently sleeping. Although she had encountered those heart-wrenching and painful things, perhaps in the depths of her heart, there was still light. She did not carry too many secrets. Her heart did not have that kind of pressure that could make people go crazy. She lived in her own time, tasting the joys and sorrows of her own life. She slept very quietly and very peacefully. White Lotus quietly looked at her, a trace of envy flashing in her eyes. Then she gently got off the bed, quietly opened the door and walked out. White Lotus walked to the road outside the door. In the quiet night, there was no light in the surrounding houses. Only a few stars in the night sky shone a little light on the world. Bai Lian looked around, then looked in the direction of the Kunlun Hall. In the deep darkness of the night, a tall figure could be vaguely seen standing in the depths of the shadows, like a huge tree that could support the heavens and the earth in the darkness. White Lotus's body trembled and a trace of fear appeared in her eyes. In that instant she seemed to have an impulse to turn around and run. But in the end she still gathered her courage and slowly walked towards the darkness. The mysterious shadow seemed to be guiding this young girl in front. Her elegant and refined but slightly pale face was particularly eye-catching in the night. The darkness clustered around her, like evil spirits cheering and grinning, entangled, dancing and lingering. The young girl walked further and further away, gradually leaving the house and walked to an unknown hidden place. There was a forest around her, but through the gaps she could still see the majestic Kunlun Temple. It was probably somewhere next to the Kunlun Temple. When the shadow suddenly stopped moving, the forest in the dark night suddenly quietened down. The insects and small animals that should have been under the grass and trees suddenly seemed to be suppressed by some power and no longer made any sound. White Lotus trembled even more violently. Perhaps she had never been so afraid of a person in her entire life, including her master, true Lord Bai Chen, who was once renowned throughout the world and had an unfathomable cultivation. In front of her, the shadow seemed to have covered her entire world. She had completely lost control of her life. Life and death, sorrow and joy, were all in the hands of this shadow. She looked at the shadow, then clenched her teeth and slowly knelt down, bowing her body to express her submission. She did not dare to reveal a trace of hostility and displeasure. With a trembling voice she said in a low voice, "Martial uncle, are your injuries healed?" A deep man's voice came from the dark shadow, asking White Lotus. White Lotus bowed her head and said, "More or less healed. I was the one who asked Lu Qin to do this. Do you hate me or him?" White Lotus's body stiffened on the ground, then she said in a low voice with a trace of determination, "No, I don't hate anyone. I did these things willingly." The shadow moved then slowly turned around. Under the faint light, the tall and burly figure of perfected Lord Tianlan was revealed. Even in such a dark corner, his big bald head seemed to stand out. This man, who stood at the peak of the entire human race, looked at the girl who knelt on the ground and did not dare to raise her head. There was a trace of contempt on his face, but it was unknown whether he was looking down on White Lotus's insincere words or indifferently looking down on all the people in the world. Perhaps he did not even bother to expose White Lotus's insincere words. He just gently waved his hand and said, "You did well last time. You would rather die than resist. It seems that your heart is still honest." Bai Lian's head touched the ground of the forest. Feeling the slightly moist and cold soil, she closed her eyes. After a while she said softly, "Martial uncle, please do not worry. Bai Lian does not have any other intentions. I only want to be at Martial uncle's side, to charge and break through the enemy lines for you, and to do my best for your great ambitions. Even if my bones are crushed, I will not regret it." Perfected Lord Tianlan did not comment. His expression was also calm, and it was impossible to tell whether he was happy or angry. It was also impossible to tell whether he believed White Lotus's words. He just silently pondered for a moment, then said, "Not long ago, I asked Lu Qin to secretly leave the Immortal City and sneak back to Kunlun Mountain to do something for me. If you are willing, you can go with him." White Lotus's body trembled. She raised her head in astonishment, clearly not understanding the intention of Perfected Lord Tianlan's sudden request. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan did not intend to explain to her at all. He only said indifferently, "If Lu Qin asks, just say that it's my idea. Follow him along the way and chat with him more, provoke his dissatisfaction towards me. If possible, you can also instigate him to secretly harm me. In short, I don't care how sinister and malicious he is. Just go ahead and do it." Bam. White Lotus kowtowed heavily and said resolutely without hesitation, "I don't dare." Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at her and sneered. "Do what I ask you to do." White Lotus felt as if her heart was about to jump out of her chest. She was extremely nervous. She stole a glance at the giant who was as terrifying as a mountain. Then, with a slight tremble, she slowly nodded. After you return to the mountain, report to me no matter what happens along the way, and any reaction from Lu Qin, perfected Lord Tianlan said. White Lotus was silent for a moment before agreeing in a low voice. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not look at her anymore and turned to leave. However, he stopped very quickly and said, "There's one more thing. You can follow Lu Qin along the way, but you are not allowed to enter the Kunlun Mountain Forbidden Area." Kunlun Forbidden Area? White Lotus was shocked, but she quickly reacted and lowered her head in agreement. Perfected Lord Tianlan went straight away and did not look back again. Perhaps in his eyes, White Lotus was just a frivolous and insignificant person like a falling leaf. Bai Lian, on the other hand, maintained her position on the ground and did not move for a long time. After a long while, a sliver of strange joy suddenly flashed across her face in the darkness. She was an exceptionally smart girl. Even though there was a world of difference between her and that person, she could still clearly feel that this person who was so powerful and almost unparalleled in the world still had a weakness. He was too powerful, too smart, and could see through the feelings of the world too thoroughly. His treacherous methods were too thorough. Everyone in the world respected and worshipped him. Who didn't? However, he could no longer easily trust another person. Even though he was willing, liked, cultivated and chose such a successor, and he wanted to hand over all his properties to him, but he could not control his suspicions. The endless suspicions that he could not completely trust a person. It was a shadow that he could never get rid of in the darkness. It always entangled and followed behind that tall and burly figure like a venomous snake. From time to time, it revealed its sharp poisonous fangs and dripped transparent but fatal venom. Chapter 525. In the dead of night, darkness shrouded the earth. In the main hall of Kunlun, there was still some light because there were some everlasting lamps that were lit in several places. However, this light was very weak and could not illuminate too far away. It also could not shine on Lu Chen's body. The black dog was lying next to Lu Chen. It did not sleep as it usually did but looked a little uneasy. From time to time it would turn its head to look around, but most of the time, it would look at the tall lotus throne in the center of the main hall. Although there was no one there at the moment, in its eyes, there seemed to be some vigilance and even hostility. Perhaps the person who sat on it was too powerful, and one day he was annoyed by the dog's barking and kicked it away. In contrast, Lu Chen was much calmer. He sat quietly with his eyes closed from beginning to end. It was not until late at night when everything was quiet that he opened his eyes. After looking outside the main hall, he said to Atsu, "Let's go." Atsu stood up, wagged its tail and trotted towards the door. It did not seem to have any nostalgia for this place and seemed to dislike it very much. Lu Chen also walked out of the main hall. The few spots of light in the main hall of Kunlun could not extend outside at all, so the darkness rushed in like a tide, crowding him in the shadows. Atsu turned its head to look at him. Perhaps because it was standing in the darkness, Lu Chen suddenly found that its eyes had turned into a light green again. It was a little different from when it came to Immortal City. The color was a little lighter, but it was clearer, like a gem that had a little dust on its surface, becoming more beautiful. He smiled and reached out to touch Atsu's head. Then he strode down the stairs and walked into the darkness of the night. In the conversation before he left, perfected Lord Tianlan had already explained most of the things to Lu Chen. As for why he did not personally make a trip for such a confidential matter, perfected Lord Tianlan also explained the reason to Lu Chen. He said that it was a critical moment in Zhangxianming where undercurrents were surging and danger lurked everywhere. He really could not leave and had to guard the situation here. Once he left the city rashly, a great change would probably occur. To this day, Zhangxianming had almost annihilated the devil cult and the world had submitted to him. Fiyunji's name was known throughout the world and everyone was in awe of him. Whether it was Zhangxianming or Lord Tianlan, their reputation and prestige were at the peak for the past hundreds of years. But now, perfected Lord Tianlan said that danger lurked everywhere? But he said that a great change was about to happen? Lu Chen did not refute this nor did he ask further. He just calmly accepted this strange and important secret mission. Then, after announcing to the public that he was in seclusion, he quietly left the giant city where the center of power in the cultivation world was located. For many years he seemed to be a person born in the dark. Whenever the night came, he would appear especially like a fish in water and could even do some things that ordinary people could not imagine. Of course, this night, he would no longer transform into the cold murderous shadow killer in his dusty memory. He just quietly took Atsu and hurriedly left the immortal city. There were no accidents along the way and the journey was very smooth. Although it was not a particularly gratifying thing, the moment Lu Qin walked out of the immortal city, he still felt a sense of relief. When he turned his head and looked into the distance, he suddenly realized that the city that was like a giant beast quietly creeping in the darkness of the night, he actually felt a kind of unconsciously tension and pressure every day he was in there. Lu Qin stood where he was for a while and then let out a long sigh. He turned around and called out to Atu, who looked far more excited than he was, who was happily scuttling through the bushes in the surrounding wilderness, sniffing and jumping madly. Lu Qin was about to continue on his way. But at this moment, Lu Qin and Atsu, who was running over not far away, suddenly sensed something and turned their heads to look at a certain place hundreds of feet away. It just so happened to be the border between the immortal city and the outside world. Under the dim light and shadows of the night, a few figures suddenly soared into the sky and quickly descended. Then they started fighting fiercely in the darkness. The sound of weapons clashing, roars, cold snorts, and screams quickly spread out in the oppressive atmosphere. It seemed that a few people were besieging a young girl, and both sides were very fierce and decisive. Every time they attacked, it seemed like they wanted to kill the other party completely. Lu Qin frowned and looked over there for a while. At this moment, Atsu had already run to his side, and after a while, Lu Qin suddenly said in a low voice, "It seems to be White Lotus?" Atsu did not confirm or deny it. He tilted his head and stood there without moving, looking like he did not have the slightest intention of going over to help. Lu Qin thought for a while, and a look of hesitation appeared on his face. This timing was indeed a bit too coincidental. Nothing happened before, nothing happened after, but on the night he quietly left the immortal city, White Lotus also wanted to leave. And then be discovered and hunted down? After pondering for a while, Lu Qin shook his head, turned around, patted Atsu's head and said faintly, "It has nothing to do with us, let's go." After saying that, he went straight away and didn't look at the fierce battle in the distance any longer. Atsu snorted, but turned back to look at White Lotus's fierce battle. But no matter how one looked at it, the dog's expression and gaze seemed to be somewhat gloating, as if it kept muttering in its heart, "Die, die quickly." After muttering a few words, Atsu ran away and after a while, it caught up with Lu Qin in front, wagging its tail and looking particularly happy. A man and a dog walked into the distant night just like that. Cruel and unscrupulous. Bastard. Stinky man. In the midst of the fierce battle, White Lotus felt as if her chest was about to explode with anger. She glanced at the man and dog in the distance, mercilessly turning around and leaving. Then she thought about her mission of chasing after Lu Qin, and how she had even thought about secretly hinting at the possibility of getting along with Lu Qin. She felt extremely wronged. Well, the reason why she thought so was because she was not stupid. She could see that although Supreme Lord Tianlan still did not completely trust his disciple, Lu Qin was, after all, the only disciple he had personally chosen. The fundamental purpose of what he did was actually to dispel her suspicion, and then she could truly trust Lu Qin. Based on this alone, Lu Qin's position in the heart of the damn Baldi was incomparable. Because other people didn't even have the qualifications to make perfected Lord Tianlan suspicious. For example, she herself. Perfected Lord Tianlan wouldn't send someone to test her because he didn't care and didn't have the intention to trust her. She knew that Lu Qin's future might really be limitless. She knew that even though she had been a proud daughter of heaven since she was young, and that her talent was unparalleled, all of this seemed worthless in the face of true power and supreme figures. She really wanted to curry favor with Lu Qin, take the opportunity to quickly make friends with him, show kindness to him, and let him take care of her in the future. However, she did not expect that Lu Qin did not intend to come at all. Does he look down on me? White Lotus was a little frightened, and then it turned into anger. The surrounding killers were still fiercely besieging. White Lotus was angry and her face was as cold as frost. She suddenly attacked fiercely, and at the same time she gnashed her teeth and said, "Damn Baldi, you sent me to do something but you didn't tell these lackeys. Are you deliberately messing with me?" Chapter 526. At daybreak, White Lotus finally broke through the encirclement. She was covered in blood as she fought her way out of the encirclement. She had shaken off the pursuers. She was exhausted and her whole body was in pain, but she couldn't care less at this moment. After confirming that she was temporarily safe, her first reaction was to start looking for Lu Qin's whereabouts. However, Lu Qin and the huge black dog had already disappeared without a trace. This was really a very miserable and unlucky feeling. White Lotus was so angry that she almost crushed her silver teeth. But obviously, even if she died of anger, no one would come to collect her corpse. So in the end, she could only swallow her anger and find a secluded forest to hide. Then, she began to treat her wounds and planned to rest for a while to recover her strength before continuing to look for traces of Lu Qin. Fortunately, she knew where Lu Qin's destination was. As long as she followed along the road to Mount Kunlun, she would probably be able to find him. This was also the only hope in this bad luck, but she didn't know when she could find him. Perhaps, when the time came, she could provoke him and make him fall out with Supreme Tianlan, destroying his future, making Supreme Tianlan suspicious of him, and it would be best if he killed him with his own hands. That would be the best. Thinking of this hatefully, White Lotus actually felt a little happy. She took off her coat and began to bandage her wounds. But at this moment, it could be seen that the battle she had experienced last night was really fierce. There were wounds on her front and back. Although they were not fatal or too serious, at a glance, the scarred appearance of this teenage girl formed an extremely harsh contrast with her elegant and refined appearance. It also made people want to sigh. Perhaps a beautiful fairy should stand high above the clouds, not eating the food of the mortal world, looking down on all living beings and being admired and revered by people. And this girl in front of them was probably the unlucky one who fell into the mortal world and fell into the dust. So, someone really sighed. White Lotus's body tensed up and she suddenly jumped up. Her expression was tense, like a fierce and angry little beast. Her eyes were cold and sharp. Looking at the shadow behind the forest, she shouted in a low voice, "Who is it?" The grass and trees shook violently. Then a black dog ran out from the shadows of the plants. It stood there and didn't come over. It just looked at White Lotus and barked. White Lotus was stunned for a moment, and a trace of astonishment flashed across her face. But somehow her body slowly relaxed. A moment later, the shadow behind Black Dog shook and Lu Qin walked out. He stood there and looked at White Lotus. His gaze swept across the wounds on her fair skin. He shook his head helplessly and said, "Do you need my help?" Scram. White Lotus sat on the ground, gnashing her teeth, her body trembling slightly. "I don't need you. Ouch, it hurts, to help me." "Just right that it hurts." Lu Qin sat behind her. Like magic, there were a lot of medicine, white cloth and other things around him. Then he treated the wound on White Lotus's back. At the same time he said, "At least they didn't put poison on their weapons. Otherwise you would be in more trouble." White Lotus clenched her fists. Her face was so pale that there was almost no blood. It was obvious that she was trying her best to bear it. After a few breaths she said angrily, "In any case they are people of Zhengxianming. How can people of the righteous side poison?" "You are wrong." Lu Qin put down the blood-stained cloth in his hand. Then he took the medicine and gently sprinkled some white powder on White Lotus's wound. White Lotus's body trembled. She sucked in a breath of cold air. Her voice was hurried and she groaned a few times. But in the end she managed to hold it back. Lu Qin put down the medicine bottle and said, "When it comes to sinister methods like poisoning, there is really no one in the world who can compare to us Zhengxianming. Oh, especially in Fiyunji. That is a place where talents and experts gather. So, you were lucky to be able to escape last night." White Lotus was silent. She did not know why, but her eyes seemed to soften a little. Behind her, Lu Qin saw that the medicine powder had been integrated into the wound. Then he began to treat the other wounds. After a while he finally finished treating the wounds on White Lotus's back. Although Lu Qin had always been a man with a heart of stone and was used to seeing blood and death, he could not help but frown when he looked at the girl in front of him. After a moment of hesitation he said to White Lotus, "These wounds are many and deep. In the future your back may have a lot of scars." White Lotus did not seem to care. She only sneered and did not turn around. She said calmly, "I also have a wound here on my chest. It can't be erased. Do you want to take a look?" Lu Qin was suddenly speechless. He looked a little embarrassed. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. He used a white cloth to gently wrap up the wounds on White Lotus's body. After everything was done he stood up and turned his back to White Lotus. Soon there was the sound of clothes being put on. Lu Qin suddenly saw Black Dog, who was lying not far away, suddenly raise its head and look behind him. Lu Qin glared at the dog. Atsu was shocked. It shrank its head and then lowered its head. Lu Qin was silent for a moment. He said slowly, "You should know in your heart that I will not tell you that I regret stabbing you. The sound behind him stopped for a moment. It was as if White Lotus's movement had stopped for a moment. After a while, White Lotus walked over after putting on her clothes. She looked at Lu Chen and said coldly, "Remember, I will return this stab to you sooner or later." Lu Chen nodded and said, "Okay, I will remember. There are probably no good people in Fuyunji, right?" As she walked out of the forest, White Lotus looked in the direction where she came from. She looked at the vague outline of the giant city and said with disgust. Lu Chen walked past her and said, "The people who surrounded you last night were probably not from Fuyunji. Otherwise you would have some troublesome things to deal with now. But, you are right." He nodded in agreement and said, "I also feel that there are not many good people in Fuyunji." White Lotus looked at him and said, "So after fighting with the demonic order for so many years, you are fighting poison with poison. What about you? You are also a kind of poison, right?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, "I am probably a kind of poison." White Lotus stared at him for a moment. She suddenly could not help but laugh. She shook her head and walked forward. She said, "I don't know why my Shirshu was blind. He actually fell for you and even accepted you as his disciple. I really don't understand." Lu Chen followed, smiled and said, "Oh, so you don't think I can do it?" White Lotus snorted and said, "You're far worse than me. In terms of birth and talent, aren't I better than you in both?" Lu Chen thought for a moment. He shook his head and did not speak. He only looked into the distance and smiled gently. He then asked, "Oh right, looking at you, could it be that you chased after me last night? What is your intention?" Chapter 527. I'm tired of staying here. I want to go home, White Lotus said. Go home. Lu Chen was momentarily dazed. After a moment of silence he said, "I actually forgot that you have a family." White Lotus rolled her eyes but she soon said somewhat helplessly, "It doesn't matter. I often forget it myself." The two of them looked at each other and laughed. Although they were far from trusting each other, the atmosphere between the two of them eased up a little. Lu Chen didn't seem to have any intention of asking White Lotus's intentions, so he continued walking forward. White Lotus's surname was Bai, and she was born in the Bai clan in Kunwu City, which was at the foot of the Kunlun Mountains. Speaking of which, when Hakushin Jinkuan was still around, White Lotus became his last disciple. However, it was widely rumored that Hakushin Jinkuan was a member of the Bai clan and that he was the Bai clan's biggest backer, which made the Bai clan quite famous for a period of time. However, just like the so-called Tianlan and Tianying, Bai Chen was in fact a Taoist name and not a real name. It was given by Tianlan and Bai Chen's master, Patriarch Tianhong, and not his real name. Therefore, Hakushin Jinkuan had nothing to do with the Bai clan. However, Hakushin Jinkuan's status was too high, so he couldn't be bothered with such rumors. The Bai clan, on the other hand, had an ambiguous attitude. Of course, they didn't dare to spread rumors in public. However, they let it slide from the beginning to the end. They acted like they were wise men and never denied it. They still held the attitude that they would be bastards if they didn't take advantage of the situation. This was no secret in the eyes of those with a bit of status in the Kunlun party. Therefore, Lu Chen never interacted with the Bai clan and didn't have a good impression of them. Back then, when he was suspicious of White Lotus, he asked Old Ma to secretly investigate them, but in the end he didn't find anything. White Lotus wanted to go home. The Bai clan was in Kunwu City, so they naturally had to go to the Westland's Kunlun Mountains. When White Lotus turned to ask Lu Chen where he was going, Lu Chen could only helplessly say, "I'm going to the Kunlun Mountains." Since their destination was the same and they knew each other, traveling together seemed to be a matter of course. However, this was only for ordinary people. Lu Chen was not an ordinary person. On the contrary, he had always been different from the others. So, what should have been a scene of the two of them loving each other and walking together didn't happen. Lu Chen said very straightforwardly to White Lotus, "The mountain is high and the road is long. Let's part ways here. Goodbye." With that, he turned around and walked away. White Lotus was stunned for a moment as if she was stunned by this man. After a while she came back to her senses. She angrily stamped her feet and chased after Lu Chen to stop him. She angrily said, "What do you mean? What did I do to provoke you? Why are you running away as soon as you see me?" Lu Chen sternly said, "I'm afraid that if I fall asleep in the middle of the night, I'll lose my life at some point." As he spoke, he actually turned to look at the black dog beside him and asked, "What do you think, Atsu?" The large black dog blinked and then nodded vigorously. He looked as if he wanted to raise his tail to show his approval. You ate those demonic beast meat for nothing. White Lotus scolded angrily and said, This stupid dog is very stupid. How can you trust it and ask it? Atsu was furious. It bared its teeth and let out a threatening growl. It looked a little scary. White Lotus didn't even look at it. She just snorted and said, What are you barking for? If you shout again, I'll let you bleed later. Atsu's neck suddenly shrank as if it was shivering. In fact, Atsu had been reborn after experiencing the southern wilderness and the Great Snow Mountain. It was no longer the same as the weak little mud in the past. However, in the past on Kunlun Mountain, the blood-eating secret method that White Lotus set up was too bloody and terrifying. It probably left a very deep and indelible impression on it. Lu Qin didn't intend to help the black dog that was immersed in its unfortunate memories. Anyway, Atsu would not die even if it was scolded a few times. He just frowned and said, We'll go our own ways and be at peace with each other. Why do you have to make it so obvious? White Lotus looked at him and suddenly sneered, If it's Su Qingjun, I'm afraid it'll be the other way around. You'll be the one pestering her to go with you, and Shiji Su won't be willing to go with you, right? Lu Qin thought for a while and actually nodded, more or less. After hearing what he said, White Lotus lost her temper for a moment. She rolled her eyes and asked Lu Qin, Why do I feel like you've been guarding against me and suspecting me? Lu Qin pointed at himself and said, Do you think I look stupid? White Lotus said, No. Lu Qin said, All right, then I don't believe you can run out of Immortal City by yourself. White Lotus said, I'm also very powerful. Lu Qin snorted and said, No matter how powerful you are, can you be more powerful than the damn Baldy? You're in his hands. As long as he doesn't let go, I don't believe you can run away. White Lotus was discouraged for a moment, then she sneered, Look at you calling the damn Baldy, it seems like you're very disrespectful to Lord Perfected Immortal? Lu Qin said, I'll give him a big head. You can go back and say that to him directly. White Lotus was dumbfounded and looked at Lu Qin as if she was looking at a monster. After a while she said, What should I say to him? I was almost suffocated by him. Now that I finally have the chance to come out, I have to take a breather before going back. Lu Qin looked at her from the corner of his eyes and said, Since you're out, you don't plan to run? White Lotus was silent for a while and said, I won't run. I'm afraid I won't be able to escape and will die even faster. Lu Qin frowned and sighed, but he didn't say anything. In the end, the two of them didn't separate and still walked on the road to Kunlun Mountain together. Although White Lotus didn't say why she came, Lu Qin pretended not to know. This was probably because people were tired of living. Atsu was a little dissatisfied with this and expressed it very clearly. However, the two humans ignored it. This made Atsu very depressed. They could only stroll around all day and refused to go near White Lotus. And White Lotus was also very loyal to her mission and began to ask some questions to Lu Qin from time to time. How old are you this year? Why are you asking this? What kind of magical power do you practice? Do you think I will tell you this kind of thing? How many people have you killed? I can't remember. How many women have you slept with? Is this something a girl like you should ask? How many? Not one. You're lying, right? Or are you lying to? Well, one last question. If you answer me properly, I won't bother you anymore. I'm already very annoyed. Don't ask any more. Have you ever really fallen in love with a woman? Lu Qin, who was walking, suddenly stopped. After a while, he walked forward in silence. During that day, he didn't talk to White Lotus again. Chapter 528. In fact, most of the time Lu Qin and White Lotus were not people who were easy to get along with. White Lotus's temperament had been nurtured since she was a child. When she was a child, she must have suffered a lot from the side of the family. But later on, when she was discovered to have a rare innate talent of 5 pillars, she immediately rose to the sky in a single step and became a treasure loved by everyone. When she was accepted as a disciple by Hakushin Jinkuin of the Kunlun party, she reached the peak of her life. Everyone was optimistic about her, and everyone thought that this girl would have a bright future in the future. Yuanying Jinren was not a problem, and even the position of deity Jinren could be expected. At that time, on one hand, White Lotus had the full support of the Bai clan, on the other hand she had the biggest backer in the Kunlun party, and on the other hand she had the eldest senior brother who was the Jinren of the Kunlun party. Everyone in the Kunlun party, from top to bottom, treated her like a fairy. In addition, she was born beautiful and moving. At a young age, she already had the temperament of a fairy from the 9th heaven. She was the perfect person in the legends. If those things did not happen later, if there was no person called Jinren Tianlan in this world, presumably White Lotus would really live a fairy-like life. But now, almost all the dazzling halos on her body had faded. Her master was dead, her senior brother had inexplicably gone into death seclusion, and there was another senior brother who was even worse, directly defecting to the enemy. Even the Bai clan, who originally regarded her as the future hope of the family's resurgence and had placed unlimited hope on her, suddenly seemed to have become deaf and blind overnight. They completely forgot about her and almost no longer mentioned her to outsiders. The situation in this world was so cruel and the gap was so big. It was already very good that White Lotus had not gone crazy and was still struggling to survive. But now her temper was really like a thorn. Except for bowing her head to the ground in front of the high and mighty Jinren and disregarding her dignity to survive, she was very cold and harsh to others. Even Lu Qin was the same. From time to time he would mock and make sarcastic remarks. In comparison, Lu Qin seemed to be in a better state. After so many years of suffering, he had long become tactful. Many times he would smile when he should laugh and he would lower his head when he should lower his head. But for some reason he still gave off a cold sense of distance. He was always far away from people, making it hard for people to see his intentions or thoughts. Or perhaps he let you see his intentions, but then you would wonder if what you saw was his sincerity. Almost everyone was like that when they were with him. No one could get close to his heart. White Lotus was like that, Su Qingjun was like that, Supreme Tianlan was like that, and even old Ma, who had spent more than 10 years with him, was like that. Perhaps it was because of this that perfected Lord Tianlan could not completely trust him? When these two people walked together, it would of course be strange if they could get along with each other in harmony and intimacy. After traveling together for a few days, Lu Qin and White Lotus, who were both smart people, quickly understood this point. But for some reason, White Lotus forcibly suppressed her temper and often took the initiative to talk to Lu Qin every day, but the atmosphere of the conversation was often very awkward. Lu Qin's reaction to this was very straightforward. He had already been in this situation, and the girl opposite him was not someone who could suppress him or directly decide his fate. So, Lu Qin had no interest in dealing with her, even if White Lotus was indeed a rare beauty in the world. Lu Qin slipped away. In the dead of night he ran faster than anyone else with the black dog. He was so unpredictable that even White Lotus could not catch up with him. She could only curse angrily in the dark night. After returning to traveling alone, Lu Qin took Atsu and traveled over mountains and rivers. After several years he finally returned to the western continent and saw the familiar majestic Kunlun mountain range. The vicissitudes and changes of the world didn't seem to change the appearance of the majestic mountains at all. Perhaps in the eyes of the heaven, earth, mountains and rivers, this bit of time was only a blink of an eye. But for some people that fleeting glimmer was their whole life. Lu Qin did not hurry to climb the Kunlun mountain. Instead he entered Kunwu City. Of course he was also very familiar with Kunwu City. Many things had happened here. In addition to the love and hatred of those years, he had actually wandered in this city even earlier when he was still a child. Later on, he was discovered and taken away by perfected Lord Tianlan, which led to the circumstances of his life later on. In all of Lu Qin's memories, Kunwu City was actually the starting point of everything. He started his life here. Walking on the familiar streets and looking at the familiar scenery, Lu Qin always had the illusion that everything here had never changed. Not only the streets, shops and houses, but even the people walking here gave him the feeling that nothing had changed since a long time ago. But this feeling was, of course, wrong. Everything had changed. There were many big mansions in Kunwu City, and the rich and powerful families with a long history all lived here. Along the way, Lu Qin was like an ordinary passerby who saw the lintel of the door and recalled the past. The Bai clan style was still very grand, but the people in front of the door seemed to have become calm and low-key. The Atsu family was obviously a bit dilapidated. Could it be that the owner didn't have the heart to take care of it? The servants at the door were all listless. Even their gazes when looking outside seemed to be drifting, as if they had lost their vitality. Later, Lu Qin stopped in front of a slightly smaller house. From a distance, he looked at the words E Manor hanging on the lintel of the door. He was silent for a long time before he finally sighed softly. In fact, if he really counted it, it hadn't been a long time since Ixan passed away, but in Lu Qin's heart, it seemed like many years had passed. But as time passed, the smile of that young girl became increasingly clear in his heart. Time didn't wear away her beauty, it just quietly occupied a corner in his heart, looking at him with a smile and quietly accompanying him. Compared to EXN, many things that happened on that soul-stirring night had faded from Lu Chen's memory. The struggle for power, the cruel fighting, the fine line between life and death, and all kinds of things that changed the fate of the world. Everything began to become distant to him. Before coming to Kunwa City, he had already asked old Ma about EXIN's situation after he left. In the end, EXIN's body was taken back by her family. Her father still loved her very much, and it was said that he was extremely sad. After taking care of EXIN's funeral, he fell seriously ill. Although he didn't lose his life, his body wasn't as good as it used to be. Even now, the cause of EXIN's death was still unclear. In other words, the real murderer still couldn't be determined. How ridiculous this may sound, but it is the truth. Someone once secretly said that it was related to the dead son of the Su family, Sumo, but it was quickly denied by the Su family. Sumo's mother, Madame Bai, denied it with grief and indignation. She would rather die than let her son's name be tarnished after his death. Her attitude was so resolute that no one else in the Su family said anything. The Yi family went to the Kunlun party to investigate, but in the end the matter was left unresolved. The Su family was a great aristocratic family, and there were some particularly outstanding people in the Kunlun party who had connections with several Yuanying enlightened masters, who told them to be a small family that only knew how to grow tea. Even if they had a Yuanying enlightened master in their sect, this wouldn't be the case. However, the Yi family didn't really make a scene because it wouldn't be beneficial to the entire family. Moreover, in some private occasions, some people who couldn't stand it spoke to them. EXIN didn't die unjustly. There were people who were furious for her, people who disregarded everything for her, and people who took revenge for her. Revenge was all that mattered. The dead's wish was fulfilled, the living had to continue living. However, this hatred was buried in the heart and passed on to their descendants. One day it would grow and sprout. That day, Lu Chen stood outside the Yi family's door, filled with emotions. He reminisced about the past, but of course he wouldn't think about the future. He just wanted to see EXIN again. To be precise, he wanted to see the wooden plaque with EXIN's name. For some reason, Lu Chen felt a little lost. He remembered how he felt when he returned to Qingshitang village and stood in front of Ding Dong's grave. They were all beautiful women in the world, but they were gone. He didn't catch them when they were alive, so after the separation of life and death, all that was left were memories. He turned and left the street, but he didn't go far. He found an inn to stay in and waited until the sky turned dark. After settling Atsu in the room, Lu Chen returned to the Yi family's house and climbed over the wall. Chapter 529. The Yi family's house was the kind that had been around for many years but was still very clean and tidy. It was well organized and well arranged. Although it was not as luxurious as the Su family's by family, it had its own elegant atmosphere. At the same time, the layout of the house was very clear. Lu Chen found the ancestral hall at the back of the Yi family's house without much effort. Most families did not have an ancestral hall. Sometimes only people with the same surname and clan in a village would have a large ancestral hall to worship their ancestors. To be able to set up a special place in the house to build an ancestral hall, it was basically a first-class family or aristocratic family. The Yi family's ancestors had lived a glorious life, so they had left behind a great legacy. There was also an ancestral hall in the house, but it didn't look very big. It was only in a corner of the house. There was a courtyard and a house with green tiles and white walls. When Lu Chen gently entered the secluded courtyard, the surroundings were quiet. Night shrouded the ancestral hall. Only a few altar lamps could be seen inside the door that was always open according to tradition. Under the dim yellow light, the shadows trembled slightly. On the quiet altar table, there were many memorial tablets with the names of the deceased written on them. Lu Chen stared at the house for a moment, then walked over. However, just as he reached the door and was about to step over the threshold, his body suddenly paused. He stopped at the door. Under the altar lamps, his face flickered in the shadows. He frowned slightly and his gaze sharpened. He turned to look at a corner of the ancestral hall. There was a place where the candlelight could not reach, and there was a wooden chair. There was a vague shadow on the chair, and it seemed that a person was sitting there. The night was quiet. There was no sound from inside or outside the house. Lu Chen did not show any fear or guilt. He just stared at the figure. After a while, the shadow moved. Then, a person stood up and slowly walked over to stand under the light. He looked like an old man with gray hair and a thin face. At the same time, his face looked as calm as an ancient well without any ripples, as if nothing could disturb him anymore. Lu Qin stared at him for a moment. He suddenly realized that the old man's features were somewhat similar to Xian's. He furrowed his brows and pondered for a moment before cupping his hands in salute and taking a step back to show that he had no enmity. Then he said, "I'm sorry to have disturbed you, Senior." After a pause he added, "Please don't worry, I'm not a thief." The old man was also looking at him. A stranger had suddenly appeared in his own home, but from start to finish, he did not show any expression of surprise or anger. He only nodded and said, "I know. There is nothing in this ancestral hall. If he was a thief he would not have come here." Even Lu Qin, who had always been tactful, did not know how to respond. Fortunately, the old man quickly said, "Although our family is a small family, we still have night guards. You must have amazing divine power to be able to sneak in here without alerting anyone. I wonder what your purpose is, could you please tell me?" Lu Qin was silent for a moment. "I am here to pay my respects to an old friend. I did not want to disturb your family, so I came here in the middle of the night. I am truly ashamed of my inappropriate behavior. I hope Senior can forgive me." The old man seemed surprised and asked, "May I ask which ancestor of the family you wish to pay your respects to?" Lu Qin hesitated for a moment before answering honestly, "Exen." The old man's body trembled slightly and his expression changed slightly. He opened his eyes and stared at Lu Qin for a long time before he suddenly thought of something and said, "You, could it be Lu Qin?" Lu Qin was shocked and nodded. "Yes, who are you? How do you know me?" The old man stared at him for a while and sighed. "Please come in." He turned and looked at the memorial tablets on the table. After a moment of silence he said, "I am Ming Xian's father." In the silent night, darkness shrouded the land. Most people were asleep except for the ancestral hall in the family's backyard. Two men sat facing each other, talking calmly. "I've asked around about what happened back then. Although our family is no longer what it used to be, we still have a few acquaintances on Kunlun Mountain," he said. Ming said this to Lu Qin. Although he didn't mention any names, Lu Qin understood what he meant. The family was a native of Kunwa City and one of their ancestors was the great Yuanying master. Even though they were weak now, they still had their ways of gathering information. Melaleuca Japonica, who took great care of Xian, and Dongfang Tao, who took Xian in as his disciple, were already friends. The ancestral hall wasn't a place to entertain guests, so there naturally wasn't any tea between them. They just sat across from each other. Ming looked at Lu Qin and after a long moment of silence, he suddenly stood up and solemnly bowed to him. Lu Qin was shocked and hurriedly moved away. "Senior, why?" Ming smiled bitterly. "No matter what, you were the one who avenged Xian back then. The family will always remember this." Lu Qin fell silent. After a while he said in a low voice, "I'm sorry I couldn't save her." Ming shook his head and turned to walk to the altar table in the ancestral hall. His eyes swept over the memorial tablets and finally stopped on the memorial tablet at the edge. He sighed softly and said, "Exen, your friend has come to see you." Lu Qin slowly walked over and looked at the wooden tablet. There was only one simple line of words on it, "Daughter Xian's memorial tablet." At that moment, his lips moved as if countless memories of the past suddenly surged into his mind. Scene after scene flashed past and then silently dissipated. He turned his head and looked at Ming with a pleading gaze. Ming sighed, nodded and moved aside. Lu Qin picked up 3 incense sticks from the altar and lit them on the altar lamp. Green smoke floated into the air, creating a dreamy scene. He stared at the memorial tablet behind Qing Yin, as if he could see the bright, kind and cheerful young girl from back then. A moment later he held the incense stick in his hand and respectfully bowed 3 times to Xian's memorial tablet, then inserted it into the incense burner on the altar table. The ancestral hall was silent. Only the green smoke floated in the air. Thinking back to one's life, one would probably become like this green smoke after death. He stood there for a long time before bowing to Ming. "Thank you for your help, Senior. I cannot thank you enough. Since my wish has been fulfilled, I shall take my leave now." Ming nodded. "The family will remember your kindness. If there is anything we can help you with in the future, please don't hesitate to ask." Lu Qin smiled but shook his head. It was not a good thing to be related to him. He cupped his hands at Ming and left the ancestral hall. He leaped into the air and flew into the deep darkness. In the distance, the majestic mountain of Kunlun seemed to be opening its chest in the darkness to welcome the arrival of this stranger. Chapter 530. The night was boundless and the majestic mountains stood tall. The majestic Kunlun stood tall in the world. No one knew how many years had passed and how many vicissitudes had it seen. Lu Chen took advantage of the night and swept up the mountain. His figure blended into the darkness, like a shadow that was no different from the surrounding darkness. He passed through quietly and did not alarm any of the patrolling guards. The curfew rule passed down by the Kunlun party for many years was obviously still in effect. In such a famous sect, in the dead of night, except for the disciples who patrolled the mountain, there were almost no other figures. In fact, based on Lu Chen's current status, his position in the Kunlun party could not be underestimated. Just being the only direct disciple of Supreme Tianlan was enough to put him in a position that was second only to one and above tens of thousands of people. After all, in today's Kunlun party, the status of Supreme Tianlan could be said to be supreme, and no one could compare to him. In other words, as long as Supreme Tianlan and Lu Chen were willing, they could announce to the public that Lu Chen had come this time, and the Kunlun party might open the mountain gate to welcome him warmly and hold a welcoming ceremony. However, this time, neither Lu Chen nor Supreme Tianlan had this intention. Instead, they were silent and did not inform the Kunlun party of their actions at all. Taking advantage of the darkness of the night, Lu Chen quietly entered the Kunlun mountain, and Black Dog went with him. They avoided the mysterious patrolling guards of the Kunlun party, went all the way deep and gradually approached the heart of the Kunlun party. In fact, it was not very easy for ordinary people to sneak into the Kunlun party, but Lu Chen had lived here for many years, and he basically knew the mountains, rivers, and geography of this place. Even Atsu had run wildly in this mountain before. Trekking over mountains and rivers was not a problem for it at all. Instead, it had a sense of familiarity as if it had returned to its hometown. Therefore, it didn't take much effort for the man and the dog to avoid the patrolling guards along the way. From afar they saw the place known as the Forbidden Area of Kunlun. The once marvelous scenery of the human world, the 4 strange mountains that were floating in mid-air, now only 3 remained. They drew long shadows in the night sky, and the place that had suddenly become empty seemed a little strange and awkward. When he was in Immortal City, Lu Chen had learned about some of the current situation of the Kunlun party from the well-informed old Ma. Of course, there were all kinds of complicated situations and undercurrents, but roughly speaking, Hakushin Jinkuan's forces had been completely erased in the past few years. Everything that used to be related to Hakushin Jinkuan had become a taboo, whether openly or secretly, and no one was willing to mention it. Even the winter peak, which had fallen, and the huge piles of soil and rocks that had fallen to the ground were still piled up on Kunlun Mountain, no one seemed to have seen it anymore. Every day, every time they saw the 3 peaks of spring, summer, and autumn, people only thought that these 3 strange peaks had always existed in the world, and there had never been a 4th peak. That was probably how shallow human relationships were. Or maybe there were some people who still remembered in their hearts that they were not unkind, but the affairs of the world had come to this. In the end, they could not be like a mantis trying to stop a chariot, and they could only go with the wind and dust. As the disciple of Supreme Tianlan, Lu Chen, of course, would not have such worries in his heart. After glancing at the empty night sky expressionlessly, his expression did not change at all, and he continued to move forward. Soon he and Atsu approached the forbidden area of Kunlun, the place that was shrouded in thick fog all year round. A small mountain that was made up of huge rocks and countless piles of soil was at the edge of the thick fog. Half of it was exposed outside the thick fog, and the other half was covered by the thick fog. In the darkness of the night, this tall mountain stood quietly. One could vaguely see that the mountain was no longer desolate, and a lot of weeds and greenery had grown on it. Life was like this. Even though the winter peak was cold and nothing could grow on it, in the years after the crash, the land that had turned into an ownerless mountain would naturally be covered with greenery after being watered by the wind and rain. Lu Chen glanced at the mountain, but he could no longer see any trace of the majestic and austere mountain from back then. Everything had completely collapsed that night, including the once insufferably arrogant glory, fame, wealth, and majesty. All that was left was the soil that had fallen into the dust in front of him. He expressionlessly turned his head, walked around the mountain, and continued to walk towards the thick fog. However, when he saw that the thick fog was getting closer and closer, Lu Chen suddenly stopped. After thinking for a moment, he turned his head to look at Atsu and said, "You better not go in with me." Atsu looked a little stunned. It tilted its head and looked into the depths of the thick fog, as if it was a little unwilling. However, Lu Chen shook his head and walked over to touch Atsu's head. He whispered, "There are some things inside. No, you don't want to see them. Just wait for me outside. Although Atsu was unwilling, it was very obedient to Luchin most of the time. It immediately nodded, wagged its tail and licked his hand. Luchin smiled and hugged it gently. Then he turned around and took a deep breath before striding into the thick fog. The fog engulfed Lu Chen's figure in the blink of an eye. At this time it was more and more obvious that this place was strange. The land was so close, but there seemed to be an invisible boundary or a transparent high wall in the void. The fog was always gathered on the side of the boundary, and no matter what, it would not cross the boundary. The gray and tall fog wall blocked all the prying eyes. Even Atsu couldn't see the situation in the fog. After Lu Chen went inside, it was as if he suddenly disappeared from this world. There was no sound or movement. Atsu waited in the same place for a long time, and gradually began to feel a little bored. It turned its head and looked around. Then its gaze fell on the earthen mountain not far away. In the night, the mountain formed by the collapsed winter peak looked like it was cut in half by the fog. The exposed half of the mountain looked very ugly and steep. Suddenly Atsu seemed to be startled. It raised its head and looked up. At the top of the mountain far away, in the darkness where the thick fog intersected, there was suddenly a glimmer of light. It was like a shadow swaying in the dark night. Atsu stared at the dark high place. After a while, it took the first step forward and began to slowly climb up the mountain. The mountain was steep and the terrain was dangerous. Although many places were covered with grass and trees, there were still some dangerous places. It was easy for sand and stones to roll down, and if one was not careful one would fall from the high place. However, Atsu was obviously very good at this. It walked all the way, jumping and running, and gradually approached the top of the mountain. Then, in the thick fog not far in front of it, Atsu's body suddenly trembled. In the thick fog, it suddenly saw a pair of huge eyes in front of it. Even the darkness could not block the light in the eyes, staring at it coldly. Above and below the mountain, in the shadow of the night, it was silent. Chapter 531. The cold wind blew and the thick fog rolled and drifted, but it always stayed on the other side of the invisible boundary line, which looked very strange. In particular, the pair of eyes that had suddenly appeared in the mist on top of this mountain made one's scalp tingle. They were dark and mysterious. Atsu took a step back, but it did not have the intention to turn around and run away. Instead, it stared at the pair of eyes, which seemed to be very bold and fearless. After a while, Atsu let out a few deep roars, but it wasn't the kind that was threatening. Instead, it seemed to have a hint of inquiry and verification. The thick fog floated slowly, and after a while, a strange sound suddenly came from the fog. Moo! Atsu's eyes immediately lit up. There was actually some excitement on his face as he took a few steps forward. Not long after, the thick fog shook, and then a huge body slowly appeared from the fog. It was a huge oxen. On Mount Kunlun, the territory of the Kunlun party, such a huge oxen could enter and exit the forbidden area of Kunlun unscrupulously without any harm. Needless to say, it could only be the special oxen of Supreme Tianlan. Atsu grinned. It had not seen this oxen for many years, but it did not seem to be too unfamiliar with this oxen. It ran up quickly and circled around this oxen a few times, barking, and excitedly stretched out its front paw to pat oxen's belly a few times. Of course, oxen should also recognize this big black dog. Although when Atsu was still in Mount Kunlun, it was still a weak native dog, but oxen was still oxen. It had helped Atsu once, so it naturally had good taste. At this moment, facing the very happy Atsu, oxen looked more like a somewhat gratified but still calm big boss. It did not show much excessive excitement, but oxen did not dislike Atsu's excited behavior. At most, it looked at it helplessly with a little tolerance. Moo! Oxen let out a cry and walked out of the fog completely. Then, like before, it found a flat place on the earthen hill and lay down on its stomach, as if it had become a part of the earthen hill. Atsu followed, still looking very excited. It chased after oxen and kept barking, until oxen's tail suddenly stood up and patted its head a few times. Atsu shrunk its head and only then did it calm down. In fact, after a few years, Atsu's appearance had also changed greatly. In terms of body shape, the mutated black dog was not much different from oxen. However, this oxen's aura was too strong. Wherever it went, it had the appearance of a king. Any creature in front of it would feel like they were a head shorter than it, which was why Atsu was still a little short. Oxen lay on the top of the earthen hill and looked into the distance. In the depths of the night, Kunlun mountain range was undulating, and everything was quiet and normal as usual. However, now that there was a black dog by his side and thinking about its origin, it was definitely not normal. Moo. This time, Oxen was looking at the black dog, and there was a trace of doubt in its voice. Atsu hesitated for a moment, and then it probably thought of the identity and background of this giant beast in front of it, so it decisively betrayed Lu Chen. It stretched out one of its front legs and pointed in a certain direction at the foot of the mountain. Oxen rolled its eyes, but it had no intention of interfering. It still lay on the ground and did not move. This made Atsu, who originally wanted to follow this big boss beast into the thick fog to have a look, a little disappointed. It could not help but let out a few soft barks. Oxen did not pay attention to it and seemed to have something on its mind. At that moment, it seemed to inadvertently look up into the sky. In the depths of the thick fog, there seemed to be a huge shadow swaying in the rolling fog, but it quickly disappeared into the depths of the fog. At this moment, suddenly, Oxen's eyes focused, and it turned its head to look at the bottom of the earthen hill. At the same time, Atsu seemed to have felt something, and at the same time, it walked to Oxen's side and looked down. In the silent night, a figure suddenly walked over from afar. Her clothes fluttered in the night wind, and her face was beautiful, like a fairy who had descended from the moon. It was White Lotus. In the night, Oxen and Black Dog did not make a sound, nor did they do anything else. They just quietly watched the girl come closer. White Lotus seemed to be very cautious, and her brows were slightly furrowed. She was also very wary of her surroundings, and from time to time she would look around. However, perhaps it was because of the angle of her line of sight, she did not seem to notice the two animals on the earthen hill. Just like that, she slowly walked around the foot of the earthen hill, and then stood in front of the thick fog. She stared at the wall of thick fog, and a complicated expression appeared on her face, and she began to daydream. Should I go in or not? On the earthen hill, Oxen turned its head to look at Black Dog, and Atsu immediately shook its head, indicating that it did not know this person at all. It was the kind of person that had no relationship with him and was very certain of it. Then Atsu's eyes turned, and it moved closer to Oxen's huge horn with its head, as if it was trying to encourage the mysterious and unpredictable Ox King of Kunlun to teach the arrogant girl a lesson for trespassing into the forbidden area. Oxen looked at it, and after a moment of hesitation, it slowly stood up. Atsu was instantly happy, and it wagged its tail and grinned silently. Of course, it was Lu Chen's first time coming to this forbidden area of Kunlun. Even though he had lived in the Kunlun party for many years, and had a secret special relationship with Lord Tianlan, he had always stayed away from places that would easily attract attention, and that was also the instinct of a shadow. However, now that he had a special mission from Lord Tianlan, the situation was naturally different. Although he had never entered this mysterious place shrouded in thick fog, since Lord Tianlan had sent him here, he would naturally have some instructions. Therefore, Lu Chen already had a good idea of the situation of this forbidden area between the clouds and the sky. For example, he now knew that the destination of his trip was not just in this thick fog. What was hidden in the thick fog was just a secret entrance. The biggest secret of the Kunlun sect, a 1,000-year-old sect, was actually hidden in the mysterious underground palace deep under the ground. To be honest, when he first heard this secret from Lord Tianlan, Lu Chen's heart reacted almost instantly, and he thought of the mysterious underground palace under the Immortal City. Although the two were very different, he did not know why, but he suddenly linked the two places together. Was it finally time for the secrets hidden under the dust of time to reveal their true faces one by one? Lu Chen walked slowly, and the surrounding fog automatically moved away from him. It was as if there was some strange thing or strange power on his body that could disperse the fog, as well as the strange things in the fog that couldn't be explained clearly. Then he walked all the way to the center of the thick fog and saw that place. Chapter 532. Lu Chen took out something from his bosom. It was a golden seal the size of half a palm. The golden seal was golden in color and radiated in all directions. The radiance that it emitted carried a sense of solemnity and solemnity. There was actually a faint aura of a king. When Lu Chen took out the golden seal and placed it on his palm, it was as if it had broken free from its shackles. The golden radiance immediately shot out in all directions. The radiance was so dazzling that it even made Lu Chen's face look like it was smeared with a layer of faint gold leaf. He had transformed into the golden statue of a deity in the temple. The dense fog that was originally entrenched and rolling in the surroundings suddenly retreated. Wherever the golden radiance passed, the fog that could not disperse in time was directly fixed by the radiance. Then it forcibly evaporated and disappeared. In that short period of time, one could still vaguely hear some low, frightened, mournful screams bursting out from the depths of the thick fog. They were filled with despair and fear. Wherever the golden radiance passed, there seemed to be no dark corners that could be hidden. Lu Qin stared at the golden seal in his palm. There was a trace of a complicated expression on his face. He gently rubbed it. From his fingertips he felt that it was hard to the touch. On top of the golden seal was carved a lifelike golden dragon. It bared its fangs and brandished its claws. It had a powerful and imposing aura. Its glaring eyes seemed to have a power that looked down on the world. When he gently turned the golden seal over, he saw that under the square seal base, there was only one word engraved: heaven. This golden seal was of course a treasure. Moreover, it was a unique treasure in the heavenly realm. However, the people in the world who knew of its existence were as rare as phoenix feathers and unicorn horns. To be exact, for thousands of years, there had never been more than 2 people who knew of this golden seal. Many years ago, this golden seal was called the Tianshou seal. It was said that the original meaning was, to live as long as the heavens. Later on someone gave it another name. It was called the Kunlun seal. Legend has it that this golden seal was forged from the essence of the majestic Kunlun mountain range by the gods of ancient times. It was the essence of the mountains, the crystallization of the earth. Then this treasure suddenly disappeared from history, never to be seen again. Or perhaps it had appeared before, but other than the owner of the treasure, everyone else who saw it was dead. Yes, since ancient times, this Kunlun seal had always been silently passed down among the inheritors of the heavenly Taoist name, and it had never been shown to the outside world, even to those of the same sect who were as close as brothers. From Tianhong to Tianlan, and from Tianlan to Tianying. These words were said by perfected Lord Tianlan to Lu Qin. That day when he handed the Kunlun seal to Lu Qin, perfected Lord Tianlan's expression seemed so relaxed, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Lu Qin with a smile and an expression that seemed to be filled with an indescribable trust. What else could prove perfected Lord Tianlan's sincerity better than this? With the Kunlun seal and the knowledge of the ancient secrets, one could freely enter and exit the forbidden area of Kunlun. One could also know and master the biggest secret in the history of the Kunlun party. If this wasn't trust, then what was trust? If this wasn't regarding him as an inheritor and wanting to entrust everything to him, then what was? Lu Qin clenched the golden seal in his hand. He looked at the scene in front of him, which was almost exactly the same as what perfected Lord Tianlan had said. There was no change at all. He frowned, and for the first time, a hint of doubt slowly appeared on his face. Could it be that the damn Baldy, was he really sincere to him? Was everything he said true? Could it be that all this time his unshakable wariness towards this person was actually all wrong? Lu Qin silently stared at the ground in front of him. Countless scenes of the past flashed through his mind, but he temporarily put them to the back of his mind. The golden seal's light flowed and flickered. An invisible force spread out. Then, without a sound, a bottomless hole that led to the dark and deep underground appeared in that mysterious land. He still had something to do. The biggest secret hidden in the Kunlun Mountains was the purpose of his trip. He clenched the Kunlun seal in his hand, took a deep breath, and then jumped down. The hole was very deep and very dark. He couldn't even see his fingers in front of him. However, the golden light of the Kunlun seal could illuminate the surroundings. Therefore, Lu Qin saw that even in this deep underground cave, there was still a dense fog. Behind the fog, there seemed to be more mysterious and strange things, bigger and scarier. Those things seemed to be sentient. They sensed that someone had suddenly intruded into this mysterious place. Therefore they were all angry, or rather they were all ecstatic and excited. Countless thick fog surged wildly and swarmed toward Lu Qin from all directions. It was as if the omnipresent darkness was laughing and roaring, wanting to devour everything. Until the golden light stopped in front of the fog. The golden light was like the solemnity of an emperor, blocking all the darkness 3 feet away. Wherever the light reached, the darkness turned into ashes. The things in the darkness roared furiously, but no matter what, they didn't dare to get close to the golden light. Lu Qin looked at the terrible scene around him expressionlessly. As he fell faster and faster, the surrounding dark fog began to appear with lightning-like silver lights. They tore through the darkness and wandered in every corner of the fog like ghosts. Sometimes they disappeared, sometimes they burst out, as if they had moved all the thunder in the sky into this abyss. When Lu Qin fell, all of a sudden all the electric light soared into the air, and suddenly there was a shrill and creepy sound in the air. At that moment, the golden light was suddenly compressed, and suddenly rolled back to less than a foot away from Lu Qin. The wind whistled and the thick fog pressed forward. When it was so close, it was as if there was only darkness in front of him, as if there was a devil opening its terrifying mouth in front of him. Behind him, above him, and in all directions, he was surrounded by the evil spirits in the fog. The next moment he would be torn apart. Lu Qin closed his eyes and no longer looked at the terrible scene around him. He just tightened his grip on the Kunlun seal in his hand. The dazzling golden light once again became bright. Although it was slow but steady, it slowly expanded in all directions. Countless low growls, with disappointment and resentment, came from the darkness and then slowly went away. The electric lights disappeared, the terrifying power that could make people crazy dissipated. The darkness became silent again, and then Lu Chen's falling speed also suddenly began to slow down. Breathing deeply, Lu Chen once again opened his eyes. Those terrible scenes seemed to be left in the darkness above his head, and no longer appeared in front of his eyes. Only he himself knew that his back was already drenched in sweat. In those dangerous moments before, if he slightly relaxed and lost his mind, what awaited him would probably be a fate that was more painful than death. His speed gradually slowed down, and the surroundings also gradually became spacious. After an unknown period of time, the Kunlun seal brought Lu Qin, and slowly landed on a piece of land. Just what kind of secret was hidden in the depths of this unknown depth? Lu Qin let out a long breath, but without any hesitation, he held the Kunlun seal in his palm, and continued to walk forward. In the distant depths of the darkness, there was a vague shadow of a huge door, faintly discernible in the darkness. Chapter 533. The figure of the girl at the foot of the hill had been standing in front of the thick fog. She did not turn around to leave, nor did she walk into the fog. On top of the hill, Oxen and Black Dog were lying side by side, looking down with a strange look in their eyes. After a while, White Lotus suddenly moved. She lifted one of her feet and seemed to want to walk forward. On top of the hill, Oxen and Black Dog immediately raised their heads and looked at White Lotus in surprise. Atsu even stood up. White Lotus leaned forward and was about to walk forward, but her foot suddenly stopped in mid-air. Then no one knew what she was thinking, but she silently retracted her foot. She stood in the same place and began to stare blankly, not moving for a long time. This confused the two animals on the hill. Atsu turned its head and looked at Oxen. Oxen also had a puzzled look in its eyes. It probably did not understand what the girl at the foot of the hill was trying to do. Atsu could not hold it in any longer. He approached the green ox and muttered a few words to it in a low voice. The green ox glared at him and shook its huge head. However, it lay down again as if it did not intend to do anything. Atsu looked in the direction of the thick fog and seemed to be a little anxious. It then looked down at the foot of the hill. Unexpectedly, White Lotus, who was standing in front of the thick fog and seemed to be hesitating whether to go in or not, suddenly took a few steps back without saying a word. It seemed like she had given up on going in. However, White Lotus's eyes were still on the thick fog in front of her. Occasionally, she would look up at the remaining three strange peaks that were still floating high in the sky. The light in her eyes was dim and difficult to see. Atsu looked back and forth and finally, it seemed like it could not stand it anymore. It was either curious or worried about Lu Qin, who had walked into the thick fog and disappeared. It turned around and looked at the fog for a while, then slowly and tentatively walked over. The place it walked to was the corner of the hill that Oxen had walked out of from the thick fog. It looked no different from its surroundings, at least from outside the thick fog. Behind it, the green ox seemed to have sensed something as well. It silently turned its head and glanced at Atsu's back. Standing in front of the thick fog, Atsu only felt that everything in front of it was gray, vague, and unfathomable. There seemed to be a kind of faintly frightening atmosphere in front of it. However, the fact that Lu Qin had walked in and Oxen had also walked out of it probably gave Atsu a lot of courage. Therefore, Atsu did not hesitate for too long. It tentatively raised its foot and stretched out its foot into the thick fog. Dog-like. The front of the dog's paw touched the fog. Just like all the fog in the world, Atsu's foot entered it without feeling anything. The thick fog in front of it was not like the terrible poisonous miasma in the legends, where anything that touched it would immediately be poisoned and turn into a pool of yellow water. Everything seemed to be normal. Except for the fact that the fog was a little thicker, it seemed to be harmless to Atsu. After a few attempts, Atsu suddenly became bold. It turned around and barked at Oxen, then walked forward. However, it did not notice that behind it, Oxen was looking at it as if it was looking at a fool. Atsu was very happy and proud. After its body entered the thick fog, it found that nothing had happened. Everything was safe. Then it wagged its tail and turned around. It proudly poked its head out of the fog and barked at Oxen. It seemed to be saying hello, but it also seemed to be saying something like, "Look at me." Oxen looked at it quietly with a strange look in its eyes. Atsu grinned. Just as it was about to show off a few more times, its face suddenly froze. It seemed to have felt something. A moment later, a trace of panic suddenly flashed across its eyes. However, before it could react, it saw the thick fog around it suddenly rolled rapidly from all directions and suddenly surrounded it. Atsu whined, and then its whole body seemed to be suddenly lifted into the air. Then, with a swoosh, the dog's head, which was the only thing left outside the fog, was suddenly dragged into the thick fog. Only a faint hole was left, and then it was immediately filled by the surrounding fog. In the depths of the thick fog far away, the angry and panicked barks of the black dog could be vaguely heard. Oxen rolled its eyes and seemed to sigh helplessly. Then it stood up and slowly walked into the thick fog step by step into the depths of the fog. About 10 feet away from the thick fog, White Lotus, who was hesitating and pacing back and forth, suddenly raised her head and looked in front of her with a somewhat surprised expression. At that moment, when she was hesitating and struggling in her heart, she suddenly seemed to hear a strange sound coming from the depths of the thick fog in front of her. It seemed to be a scream, a little panicked and a little shrill. Perhaps it was because of this that White Lotus actually could not tell what it was. Was it a human, a beast, or one of those mysterious spirits and ghosts in the legends? This thick fog sealed off the forbidden area of the Kunlun party. For many years, the Kunlun party had forbidden ordinary disciples to come here. In other words, great cultivators who were above the level of Jinren Yuanying would have some opportunities to go to the 4 strange peaks above the clouds in the sky to cultivate. However, this place on the ground seemed to have always been a place that only the few people with the highest status could enter. In other words, in the past 100 years, it seemed that the only people who could set foot in the forbidden area of Kunlun were Lord Tianlan and her deceased master Hakushin Jinkuan. Until today there was a third person, Lu Chen. Carrying the strange order secretly given by Lord Tianlan, White Lotus of course knew that the final destination of Lu Chen's journey to the west was the forbidden area of Kunlun. Therefore, although she was cunningly thrown off by Lu Chen halfway, she was very angry but not flustered. She directly returned to the Kunlun party and sneaked into the vicinity of the forbidden area of Kunlun Mountain. After waiting patiently for a period of time as expected, Lu Chen also came here with Black Dog. However, along the way, the matter of probing Lu Chen that was originally given to her by Lord Tianlan had completely failed. If it failed, then so be it. Anyway, when the time came, she just had to find a way to evade it. Otherwise there was no better way. However, the forbidden area of Kunlun in front of her made White Lotus feel a little conflicted. Many years ago, when she was still a disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan, she lived on the winter peak of the 4 strange peaks. At that time she looked down from the sky. Of course, she could see the thick fog on a sunny day. She used to be curious about what was in the forbidden area. However, now that time had passed, even the winter peak had been destroyed in the mountain. Naturally, the feelings of the past were no longer there. Even if it was her, she was just a pitiful person who lived under someone else's roof and had to rely on someone else. But what secret was hidden in this thick fog? Judging from the solemnity of the Kunlun party, there must be a big secret in it. Then, could this secret be an opportunity that she longed for? No matter who it was, falling from the high clouds to the dust all of a sudden, from a proud daughter of heaven to a puppet whose life and death were in the hands of someone else, everyone would feel indignant and want to break free. No matter how big the price was, they would be willing to pay. White Lotus's expression kept changing. Then she could not help but slowly approach the thick fog. In the next moment she suddenly gritted her teeth, and then she strode forward and walked into the mist as well. She was walking towards her unknown fate. Chapter 534. In the dead of night, the Kunlun Mountains, shrouded in darkness, looked like a giant who had fallen asleep. The Kunlun party's curfew had been passed down for many years, and it hadn't changed to this day. In the pitch-black night, most places were shrouded in darkness. Except for the Kunlun party sect leader, a certain corner of the Xingyang Hall where the sect leader of the Kunlun party resided. The current Kunlun party's acting sect leader, the Thousand Lantern sect leader, was still awake. He was sitting in front of a desk with a lit candle on it. The candle was covered with a delicately crafted lampshade, allowing the dim candlelight to illuminate the area around him. It also illuminated his solemn and indifferent expression. The Kunlun party had been established for thousands of years. Naturally, it had already seen countless worldly affairs in the world. Occasionally, an accident happened to the sect leader, and the sect would nominate a temporary sect leader to take over the position. But of the people sitting in this position, he was probably the only one who hadn't removed the word acting from his title for so long. Under the candlelight, there was nothing on the smooth and flat table. There was only a letter placed in front of the Thousand Lantern sect leader. The Thousand Lantern sect leader's gaze fell on the letter. There were a few lines of words on it, heavy and powerful, with an extraordinary bearing. The meaning between the lines was also very simple. In the next few days, the strength of the patrolling guards on Kunlun Mountains should be relaxed. There wasn't even a signature at the end of the letter, and the words between the lines were all direct narration without any honorifics. Although he didn't scold or hurl insults, his words were straightforward, and there was a faint condescending and superior tone that seemed to be on the verge of bursting out. The Thousand Lantern sect leader looked at the letter expressionlessly. He read the words on the letter word by word. He didn't know how many times he had read it, but his face was gloomy. Suddenly he stood up, turned around and walked towards the door. In the middle of this, his wide sleeve brushed across the table. When it slid down the table, the letter on the table had already disappeared. Pushing the door open, the Thousand Lantern sect leader walked into the darkness. In the deep night, there was only darkness around him. There wasn't a shadow of a person. Even he himself looked like a ghostly shadow walking in the night, moving forward alone. The cold night wind blew past. He passed through the corridors and walked along the stone path, walking further and further into the night. He did not meet anyone along the way because he had secretly arranged for the night patrol guards to be sent away. People's moods change, don't they? Thinking back to when he first ascended to the throne, he was full of ambition and looked down on everyone. He felt that his achievements were so brilliant, that his 100 years of forbearance were not in vain. Once he grasped great power and one day he would be filled with great ambition and ambition. He would definitely make a peerless achievement, make the people of the world look at him, make tens of thousands of people respect him, and make the majestic Kunlun's successive generations of founding masters sigh with admiration and pride. Only in this way could he live his life in vain. Only in this way would he be worthy of his abilities, and he wouldn't have wasted so many years of suffering. A cold night breeze blew over, brushing past his cheeks. The chill was like a knife. Qian Dengzhenren's footsteps slowed down. He looked at the sky, the corner of his eyes slightly twitching, but there was grief and indignation in his eyes. But who would have thought that things would turn out like this? His ambition was empty, and he carried the title of sect leader spiritual master in vain. But how many disciples and how many forces in the sect could not work together until today? Each one of them secretly colluded, each one of them paid lip service, and each one of them opposed in secret. Even the two words acting sect leader spiritual master, in front of his head, in a flash of many years, unexpectedly no one proposed to remove it. Why was this? That year when he first ascended to the throne, he sat upright on the high platform, majestic and solemn. Every day when he walked through the sect, the disciples who saw him would respectfully salute him, calling him sect leader spiritual master. How comfortable and happy was that? Even if he carried a solemn expression on his face, his heart was truly happy. But now, so many years had passed, but the two words acting still existed in his title, and his mood had also changed drastically. The disciples who met him in the past were still respectful when they saw him, and even the way they addressed him didn't change. But in his heart, there was no longer the slightest bit of happiness. Qian Dengzhenren couldn't help but secretly think in his heart, these people, these seemingly respectful disciples, every time they saw him and addressed him respectfully, were they laughing in their hearts? Were they secretly ridiculing him, the acting sect leader spiritual master who had held the position for the longest time in history? Every day, Qian Dengzhenren felt that his days were beginning to become torment, because he constantly discovered that everyone under the heavens didn't respect him very much. In everyone's hearts, the Kunlun party still had a real emperor, and that was the true existence that everyone revered. That person was like a sun, burning fiercely, radiating boundless light, suppressing all other radiance so that everyone could only see him. Even the sect leader's spiritual master, who was supposed to be the highest leader of the Kunlun party, was overshadowed in front of him. This matter shouldn't have been like this. Qian Dengjinren stopped in his tracks. In this boundless night, he passed through the curtain of night and finally arrived at the foot of a dark mountain. There was a tightly shut cave abode there, and the entrance was overgrown with weeds as if it had long been abandoned. Qian Dengjinren quietly stood at the entrance of the cave abode, a trace of hesitation and doubt in his eyes. But when he clenched his hands in his wide sleeves, he touched another light object. It was like a letter that was as light as a feather. But for Qian Dengjinren, that letter was perhaps as heavy as Mount Tai. He took a deep breath, threw all his worries to the back of his mind and quietly walked over. The abandoned cave abode's stone door was tightly shut, but traces of the restrictions could still be faintly seen. But for Qian Dengjinren, who had grasped many of Kunlun's secrets, this was no problem at all. He easily unlocked the restrictions, and as the heavy stone door opened, he walked in. Darkness extended ahead, but the air was unexpectedly not oppressive and oppressive. It should be because this place had maintained good ventilation for many years. After walking through the dark passage, there seemed to be a somewhat oppressive light coming from the depths of the cave abode. At the same time, in the depths of the dark shadows behind the light, there seemed to be a voice that lightly coughed and let out a sigh. Qian Dengjinren looked in that direction, and without further hesitation, he directly walked over. The darkness clustered around his figure as he walked into the depths of the cave, and he saw the source of the light. It was a bright pearl embedded in the rock stratum above his head, emitting a faint glimmer. Behind the light was a stone bed, and a figure was sitting on it without moving at all, as if he was a wooden statue. A few chains that were suspended in the shadows were deeply nailed into the incomparably hard stone wall. At the same time, with the help of the faint light, one could see the strange runes on the chains. The light was flickering and a strong aura of magic power was constantly emitting from them. The figure in the shadows slowly raised his head and glanced at Qian Dengjinren. Qian Dengjinren's expression was complicated as he stared at the darkness. After a moment, he sighed and said, "Long time no see, senior brother." Chapter 535. The face of the person in the shadows was a bit indistinct. His long hair draped over his shoulders, but he didn't appear unkempt. His clothes could also be considered neat and tidy, as if he had lived in seclusion for a long time. He raised his head and looked at Thousand Lantern, who had just walked in. His eyes faintly flickered in the darkness outside of the luminous pearl's light. After a while, the person's body moved as if he wanted to get up, but a strange sound suddenly came from his surroundings. The iron chains hidden in the shadows trembled, and several of the strange runes that were filled with the aura of spiritual power lit up. As a result, he quickly sat back down and let out a muffled groan as if he was in pain. But he quickly regained his composure and nodded to Thousand Lantern. "Long time no see, junior brother Thousand Lantern. It's inconvenient for me to move around here and I can't get up to greet you. You can do as you please." Thousand Lantern Taoist was speechless. He looked around and saw that there wasn't even a stone bench in the stone room. Even if there was a stone bench, it probably wouldn't be of any use. After a moment of silence, he walked over to the side of the stone bed where the figure was. He didn't care about the dust that fell from the bed and just sat down on the edge of the stone bed. At this moment, the distance between Thousand Lantern Taoist and that figure was only about an arm's length. That person had been sitting in the shadows and looking at Thousand Lantern Taoist. He seemed to be very calm and didn't show any signs of anger. Instead, he looked at Thousand Lantern Taoist's expression and suddenly smiled. Then he said, "What's wrong? You look like you've encountered something difficult." Taoist Qian Deng's hands were hidden in his sleeves. Because of the position he was sitting in, half of his face was exposed to the light of the luminous pearl, while the other half was hidden in the shadows. At first glance, he seemed to be divided into two halves by the light and the darkness. Black and white were distinct, but his expression was uncertain. After hearing the question from the person in the shadows, Thousand Lantern was silent for a moment before replying, "I didn't think that sitting in this position would be so difficult." The man stared blankly for a moment. He probably didn't expect Thousand Lantern Taoist to say such a thing to him. After a while, he smiled bitterly and shook his head without saying anything. Taoist Master Qian Deng asked again, "Shixiang, when you were the sect leader, did you have the same feeling as me?" "That's right." In the entire Kunlun party, the only person whom Taoist Master Qian Deng would address as senior brother was the former sect leader Taoist Master, who was now forced to go into seclusion due to severe injuries. In the past, his name had shaken the world, but today he was a prisoner, unable to see the light of day and dying without a sound. If it was anyone else, perhaps such a fortuitous encounter would drive them insane. However, Perfected Idol Month seemed to be able to remain calm. From the beginning to the end, his expression and words did not change much. After hearing Taoist Master Chen Deng's words, he pondered for a moment before replying in a soft voice, "You have martial uncle Tianlan above you now, but when I was in your position, there were two great gods, my master and martial uncle Tianlan above me." Taoist Master Chen Deng was silent. After a while he turned his head to look at Perfected Idol Month. In the darkness, Perfected Idol Month also looked at him. Their gazes met and a moment later they both smiled bitterly. Looking at such a situation, probably no one would have thought that on a certain full moon night a few years ago, the two of them would be archenemies who couldn't coexist like fire and water. "You didn't come here today just to vent your grievances to me, did you? Is there anything else?" Perfected Idol Month asked. Taoist Master Chen Deng frowned and pondered. His eyes swept over the inconspicuous but frightening dark chains around Perfected Idol Month. After a while he said softly, "When I rose up, I wanted to get rid of you, and I also wanted to sit in the position of sect master. The expectations of generations of masters of Baichao Tang are all on me, and I must do it." Perfected Idol Month nodded and said, "I understand." The corner of Taoist Master Chen Deng's eyes seemed to twitch slightly, and then he said, "But I thought about killing you, but I didn't think he would imprison and torture you like this. I really don't understand why he didn't just kill you directly." Taoist Master Idol Moon also became silent. Perhaps it was because the he mentioned by Taoist Master Chen Deng was too powerful and carried a boundless and terrifying pressure. Even though he wasn't here, the two of them still felt suffocated and oppressed. He just sighed and said with a wry smile, "Martial Uncle's heart is as deep as the sea. Who knows what he is thinking?" Taoist Master Chen Deng was silent for a while, and then he said, "I once asked Martial Uncle Tianlan about this. He told me that since ancient times, there have been many internal conflicts in the Kunlun party, but there has never been a case of killing a sect master." Perfected Idol Month was stunned, and then he shook his head with a wry smile. After he finished speaking, Taoist Master Chen Deng's expression was similar to Perfected Idol Month's. Of course, such words had no credibility. Since ancient times, the Kunlun party had never killed a perfected cultivator of Huashan realm in an internal conflict. Then what about Hakushin Jinkuan? Perfected Idol Month closed his eyes, looking quiet and serene. Even though he was not free at the moment, he still looked a little like the solemn and dignified old days. After a while, he lowered his voice and said, "Junior brother Chen Deng, if you have anything to ask me, just ask. I'm already like this, so why can't I say it?" Taoist Master Chen Deng frowned and looked at Perfected Idol Month with some hesitation. But after a while he seemed to think of all the shackles of time in the past few years, and finally he slowly leaned toward Perfected Idol Month. "Senior brother, you've been the sect master for many years. How much do you know about the forbidden area under the clouds in the sky behind the mountain?" The soft and low voice began to echo in this unknown and dark cave. It was always easy to get lost in the dark. Sometimes they would lose their direction. Sometimes they would lose their sense of time. Sometimes they would even lose themselves. They would feel that everything in the past was wrong. However, when they wanted to choose a new path, they would either find that it was too late, or they would see only darkness in front of them. There was no light at all. When Lu Qin walked in the darkness, in the silence, his mind inexplicably recalled the first half of his life. Like a shadow, he often lived in the dark and walked behind the light until one day he personally shattered the darkness. He had never regretted it, and he could not regret it, because when he stabbed Yun Shouyang's back with his saber, he was destined to have no way out. He was a shadow, but he was destined to belong to the light. He raised his head and stopped walking. The huge door appeared in front of him. The golden light of the Kunlun seal sprinkled on the ancient door, as if it was narrating the dust-laden history of the past. He silently looked at it and then walked forward. For some reason, the darkness here was especially thick, and even the golden light could not force back the shadow. Therefore, when looking from the back, one could clearly see that Lu Qin was walking out of the darkness with the golden seal, and step by step, he walked into the depths of the darkness until the darkness completely swallowed his figure and then disappeared without a trace. Boom. In the depths of the distant darkness, there seemed to be a low and deep sound, as if a heavy door had opened a small gap and then slowly closed. Chapter 536. Lu Qin had already discovered that the darkness he was in was different from the darkness he had been in before. The darkness here was particularly thick. Although people did not feel any discomfort in it, the oppressive feeling was unusually obvious. If all the darkness of the night in the human world was like a thin veil of mist, once a light shone, it would retreat calmly and quietly. But at this moment, inside and outside this ancient and huge door, the darkness here was so thick that even the light seemed to be swallowed. There was light in the darkness. It came from the Kunlun seal in Lu Chen's hand. The golden light was still flickering, but it was different from when he was walking in the thick fog on the ground. At that time, when the fog encountered the Kunlun seal, it was as if it was facing a great enemy like a tiger, and they all avoided it. But in this underground ancient cave, especially when Lu Chen walked behind this huge ancient door, the darkness had been silently lingering around him. Even the golden light of the Kunlun seal could only illuminate a small area nearby. A little further away, the light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness, silently disappearing into the shadows. Lu Chen also heard the muffled sound of a door closing behind him. He knew that the ancient door had closed behind him. From this moment onwards, everything suddenly became quiet, and there was only darkness in front of him where he couldn't even see his own fingers. Lu Chen took 2 steps back, and his back leaned against the incomparably hard door. A cold air seeped into his body through his clothes. For some reason, Lu Chen's body suddenly trembled, and then he discovered that the black flame hidden in his Dantian sea of qi suddenly jumped, as if it was stimulated by something, or perhaps it was awakened by something, and it slowly burned. In his eyes in the darkness, 2 clusters of black flames began to appear and burn fiercely. Lu Chen was taken aback. He quickly recalled that a few years ago when he was still in the Kunlun party, the black fire in his body was suddenly awakened. He was also very shocked at that time, but he could not figure out where the black fire in his body, which was similar to the black fire in his body but had an obviously primitive and ancient aura, came from. Until today he suddenly understood that the source of that power was here. In the depths of Kunlun Mountain, apart from the things that Supreme Lord Tianlan had told him in private, there was another side to the great secret that had been hidden for 1,000 years. His expression became somewhat strange and wonderful in the darkness, and an indescribable feeling emerged in his heart. After standing still for a moment, Lu Chen finally made up his mind and began to walk forward. The darkness was as deep as the sea, completely obscuring one's vision. As far as the eye could see, there was almost no light except for the Kunlun seal in his hand. Lu Chen could not see anything more than a foot around him. In the darkness, this place could be as wide as the sea, or as narrow as a shack. If he took one more step he would hit the wall. Every step was taken very carefully because in such darkness he did not know whether his next step would be empty, whether he would step on a trap, or whether something strange would happen. However, from another angle, in a vast and empty space of darkness that had suddenly been magnified countless times, something moved slightly in the darkness. Looking up, the glimmer of light in the distance was swaying in the dark sea, slowly walking over. Lu Chen did not know how long he had walked or how far he had walked, but in his perception he seemed to have walked very far and a lot of time had passed. However, he clearly remembered that on the night before he left Mount Celestial Dragon, Supreme Lord Tianlan had clearly told him that in this place, all his perceptions could be wrong. This place was different from the entire cultivation world of the Divine Land. This place was unique in this world, this was the territory of that thing. In any case, Lu Chen still felt that he had walked for a very long time and he felt a little tired. However, he immediately realized that this feeling of fatigue should not have appeared after he walked. Years of cultivation had long tempered his body. Purely walking without any spiritual power consumption, he should not be tired even if he walked for 3 days and 3 nights. There was indeed something strange here. He stopped and looked around attentively. However, except for a few feet of space he could not see anything else. Darkness surrounded him and everything seemed to be silent. Suddenly there was a flash of light. It was the light on the Kunlun seal in his palm, which suddenly swayed. Lu Chen immediately felt it and looked down at the Kunlun seal. He saw that the golden seal, which was originally shining with golden light, was now as lustrous as before, but the light it emitted could not penetrate the surrounding darkness. And this golden light, which had been very stable all the way, suddenly shook at this moment. The light on the golden seal flickered, like a human's heartbeat, or like the breathing of a beast, constantly expanding and contracting. Suddenly, Lu Chen seemed to hear something. It was a movement that slowly came from the deepest part of the darkness. Hiss. The sound was not loud and it was a little vague, making it unclear and unreal. He faintly felt that there was something rubbing against the hard ground and rocks. And not long after, the sound disappeared as if it had never existed. Was it an illusion? Lu Chen raised his head. Suddenly, a chill blew from the front. It was a cold wind, and it also carried a trace of indescribable fishy smell. Hiss! The same vague sound appeared again, but this time it was clearer and closer. Lu Chen even lowered his head to look at the ground under his feet because at that moment when the sound sounded, he actually felt the ground under his feet was slightly trembling. That sound seemed to be slowly approaching him in the darkness. A cold, tyrannical and indifferent aura slowly seeped out of the darkness, and the darkness began to faintly roll in front of Lu Chen's eyes. In the distance, nearby, the ground trembled and an incomparably huge shadow slid and slid. The shadow hovered like a mountain, surrounding the unusually small human figure in the middle. Lu Chen did not speak, nor did he shout. He just gritted his teeth, silently raised the Kunlun seal in his hand, raised it to the highest point and then opened his palm. Golden light emitted from the Kunlun seal, shining brightly and solemnly. The surrounding sound quieted down, and after a moment, suddenly a light lit up beside Lu Chen. It was a white and dazzling light reflecting the huge pale teeth. Yes, it was the head of an almost indescribable giant beast that suddenly appeared beside Lu Chen. Its mouth was even twice the size of Lu Chen's, and its sharp fangs were exposed, reflecting the Kunlun seal. Hiss! The strange sound echoed again, and the huge shadow in the darkness slowly straightened its body in front of Lu Chen. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.